Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The crunch of gravel under my boots echoed through the crisp morning air as I stepped out of my car. I inhaled deeply, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. This solo hiking trip was long overdue, a chance to clear my head and escape the suffocating grip of city life and recent personal turmoil. I shouldered my pack, its weight a comforting presence against my back. The trailhead stood before me, a wooden arch marking the entrance to the vast wilderness of the Coconino National Forest. A weathered sign warned of potential dangers. Caution, rugged terrain, hikers proceed at own risk. As I approached the arch, a chill ran down my spine despite the warm Arizona sun. Something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but an unsettling stillness permeated the air. The usual chattering of birds and rustling of small animals in the underbrush was noticeably absent. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves and too many late nights binge-watching horror movies. With a deep breath, I stepped onto the trail, the soft pine needles cushioning my steps. The forest closed in around me, towering ponderosa pines stretching towards the sky. Their branches seemed to whisper secrets to one another, the wind carrying fragments of hushed conversations just beyond my comprehension. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, creating islands of warmth in the cool shade. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, the terrain grew more rugged. The well-maintained trail gave way to a narrower path, roots and rocks jutting out to trip the unwary. I picked my way carefully, my senses alert for any sign of danger, both natural and otherwise. Hours passed, and the nagging feeling of unease grew stronger. More than once I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision. But each time I turned, there was nothing but the silent forest stretching out behind me. I paused to consult my map and take a swig from my water bottle. As I studied the contour lines, trying to gauge my progress, a twig snapped somewhere in the underbrush to my left. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw only shadows between the trees. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded small and fragile in the vast emptiness of the forest. No response came, save for the faint echo of my own words mockingly repeated back to me. Unnerved, I picked up my pace, no longer stopping to admire the rugged beauty around me. The shadows seemed to lengthen, despite the sun still being high in the sky. Twice more I heard sounds that didn't quite fit. A rustle too heavy to be a small animal, the scrape of something rough against bark. As the day wore on, exhaustion began to set in. I knew I should start looking for a suitable campsite soon, but the thought of spending the night in this forest filled me with a nameless dread. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to return to the safety of civilization. But pride and stubbornness pushed me forward. I was an experienced hiker after all. I wouldn't let some baseless fears send me scurrying back to my car like a frightened child. Just as I had resolved to continue on, I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint unlike anything I had ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with long, claw-like impressions at the end of each toe. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp and clean. My blood ran cold as I stared at the impossible track. Whatever had made it was close, too close. And as that realization sank in, I felt the weight of unseen eyes boring into me from the surrounding forest. I was no longer alone on this trail, and whatever watched me from the shadows was anything but human. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the massive footprint. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear, maybe? But the shape was all wrong. Too elongated, with those unnaturally long claw marks. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I snapped a photo. The flash seemed obscenely bright in the deepening gloom of the forest. Pulling out my map again, I tried to orient myself. There was a ranger station marked about 5 miles ahead. If I pushed hard, I could make it before nightfall. But that would mean following the trail, the same trail where this thing had left its mark. A rustling in the underbrush made me jump. I spun around, heart pounding, to see a scraggly-looking coyote emerge from the bushes. It regarded me with eerily intelligent eyes, head cocked to one side. Something about its gaze unsettled me deeply. It didn't move like a normal coyote. Its gait was too smooth, almost human-like. As I watched, frozen, the coyote's form seemed to shimmer and distort for a split second. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, the animal was gone, melting back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. Shaken, I set off down the trail at a brisk pace, constantly scanning my surroundings. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. Every shadow seemed to conceal some lurking threat, every rustle of leaves a potential attack. "Hey there, stranger," a gruff voice called out, nearly stopping my heart. I whirled to see an old man emerging from a barely visible side trail. He was lean and weathered, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. "You're a long way from anywhere," he continued, studying me intently. "These woods ain't safe for solo hikers, especially not with night coming on." I explained about the ranger station, showing him my map. His eyes narrowed as he looked at it, then back at me. "That station's been closed for years," he said softly. "Whoever gave you this map was playing a cruel joke, or worse." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, or worse?" I asked. The old man sighed, glancing nervously at the deepening shadows around us. "There's things in these woods that ain't natural," he muttered. "Things that hunt alone hikers. They lure 'em in deep then." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You've seen something?" I pressed, thinking of the strange footprint and the coyote's unnatural behavior. His eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Seen? Nah, you don't see 'em, not really. You just feel 'em watching. And sometimes, if you're real unlucky, you hear 'em." A distant howl echoed through the trees, making us both jump. It started as a wolf's cry, but twisted halfway through into something that sounded disturbingly like a human scream. The old man's face went pale. "You need to get out of these woods right now," he hissed. "Head back the way you came and don't stop for nothing. Don't look back, and whatever you do, don't answer if you hear someone calling your name." Before I could ask any more questions, he turned and hurried back down the side trail, quickly vanishing into the gathering darkness. I stood there, paralyzed with indecision. The rational part of my brain said this was all nonsense, just an old man trying to scare a city slicker. But deep in my gut, I knew he was telling the truth. As if to confirm my fears, I spotted another set of tracks a few feet away. These were different from the first, smaller but still clearly inhuman. They seemed to shift and change as I stared at them, sometimes looking like deer prints, sometimes like bare human feet. The sense of isolation crashed over me like a wave. I was alone in this vast, indifferent wilderness, being stalked by something I couldn't begin to understand. As the last light faded from the sky, I realized I had a choice to make: risk the darkness and whatever lurked within it to try and retrace my steps, or find a place to hunker down for the night. Neither option seemed particularly appealing as another inhuman howl echoed through the gathering night. The fading light seemed to drain the color from the world, leaving everything in shades of gray and deepening shadow. I stood rooted to the spot, indecision paralyzing me as I weighed my options. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, urging me to turn back. But the thought of navigating the treacherous trail in darkness terrified me almost as much as what might be lurking in the woods. With trembling hands, I pulled out my flashlight and compass. To my horror, the compass needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on any direction. I shook it, tapped it, but nothing helped. It was as if the very magnetic fields of the earth had gone haywire in this godforsaken forest. Left with no choice, I pushed on, hoping to find a defensible spot to make camp. The beam of my flashlight carved a tunnel of visibility through the encroaching darkness, but it also made me feel exposed, like an actor on a stage with an unseen audience lurking just beyond the lights. As I walked, the forest sounds began to change. The normal nighttime chorus of insects and nocturnal creatures took on an odd, almost rhythmic quality. It was subtle at first, but grew more pronounced with each passing minute. The chirps and rustles seemed to form patterns, almost like words in a language just beyond my comprehension. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was my mother's voice calling my name from somewhere in the darkness behind me. "Charlie? Charlie, where are you?" I froze, my heart pounding. It was impossible. My mother had passed away years ago, yet her voice rang out again, clearer this time, tinged with worry. "Charlie, please, I'm lost. I need your help." Every instinct screamed at me to run towards her voice, to help her, but the old man's warning rang in my ears. "Don't answer if you hear someone calling your name." Gritting my teeth, I forced myself to keep walking, tears stinging my eyes as my mother's voice called out again and again, growing more desperate each time. It took every ounce of willpower not to answer, not to run back and search for her. As I pushed on, I stumbled upon a small clearing. To my horror, I saw the remains of an old campsite, a fire pit filled with ashes, tattered scraps of a tent, and a backpack that looked like it had been torn apart by massive claws. Amongst the debris, a weathered journal caught my eye. With shaking hands, I picked it up and flipped it open. The pages were filled with increasingly frantic entries describing experiences chillingly similar to my own. The final entry simply read, "It's here. God help me, it's wearing my wife's face." A twig snapped behind me and I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I saw a tall, emaciated figure at the edge of the clearing. Its skin seemed to ripple and shift as if struggling to maintain its shape. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows with unnatural speed. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I knew I should keep moving, but exhaustion was taking its toll. The clearing, for all its unsettling signs, at least offered some visibility. With no better options, I made the fateful decision to make camp. As I set up my tent with trembling hands, a chorus of inhuman howls erupted from the surrounding forest. They started as wolf cries, but morphed into something that sounded terrifyingly like laughter. Huddled in my tent, I realized that the true horror of my situation was just beginning. The long night ahead promised horrors I could scarcely imagine, and dawn seemed an eternity away. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle, every snap of a twig outside my tent sent waves of terror through me. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate approach of the thing I'd glimpsed earlier. The forest had fallen into an unnatural silence, broken only by occasional whispers that seemed to come from just outside the thin fabric of my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened, I began to make out words. "Charlie." The voice was barely audible, a sibilant hiss that made my skin crawl. "We're waiting for you, Charlie. Come out and play." I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only seemed to get louder, as if it was coming from inside my own head. "You can't hide from us, Charlie. We see you. We smell your fear." A shadow fell across my tent, the silhouette of a tall, misshapen figure visible through the fabric. I held my breath, praying it would move on. The shadow lingered, swaying slightly as if in some unfelt breeze. Suddenly a new sound cut through the whispers, the distinct zip of my backpack being opened. I sat bolt upright, fumbling for my flashlight. When I finally managed to turn it on and shine it towards my pack, I saw that it had been torn open, its contents strewn about. My food was gone, all of it. Even the sealed packets had been ripped apart, their contents scattered across the tent floor. My water bottle lay empty, punctured by what looked like teeth marks. Panic rose in my throat. Without food or water, my chances of survival dropped dramatically. I knew I should do something, try to gather what was left, maybe attempt to filter some water from a stream. But terror kept me rooted to the spot. As dawn approached, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They took on the voices of people I knew, my father, my best friend, my ex-girlfriend. Each one called to me, begging for help, hurling accusations or making promises too sweet to be true. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a new voice joined the chorus. This one was different. It sounded like my own voice, but twisted, distorted. "Come out, Charlie," my own voice taunted. "Come see what you really are. Come embrace the darkness inside you." With trembling hands, I reached for the tent zipper. Some part of me knew this was madness, that I should stay put until daylight, but a stronger urge pushed me forward, a morbid curiosity to confront whatever horrors awaited me. As I pulled the zipper down, the whispering reached a fevered pitch. I poked my head out, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam around the clearing. At first I saw nothing. Then at the edge of the light I caught a glimpse of movement. Something was there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, something that seemed to shift and change with each passing second. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. The response came not in words, but in a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a laugh, but not any laugh I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost subsonic, then rose to a piercing shriek that set my teeth on edge. It was the sound of madness given voice, of every nightmare and dark thought made audible. As the laughter faded, I became aware of movement all around me. The shadows themselves seemed to be alive, writhing and twisting in ways that defied natural law. In that moment, I knew with dreadful certainty that I was no longer the hunter exploring the wilderness. I had become the prey, caught in a trap laid by something far older and more terrible than I could comprehend. With the first light of dawn still hours away, I retreated into my tent, knowing that the true ordeal was only beginning. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I made a desperate decision. I couldn't stay here, waiting to become prey. With shaking hands, I packed what little remained of my supplies and broke camp. The forest was eerily silent as I set off, no bird song or rustling leaves to break the oppressive quiet. Every step felt like it was being watched, evaluated by unseen eyes. I tried to retrace my path back to the trailhead, but the landscape seemed to have shifted overnight. Nothing looked familiar. A twig snapped behind me and I broke into a run. Panic overrode reason as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear something pursuing me, its footfalls changing from the heavy thuds of a large predator to the lighter patter of something smaller, then back again. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing chasing me was a blur of shifting forms, one moment a massive bear, the next a wolf, then something vaguely human but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Its eyes, though, remained constant, ancient, hungry, and filled with a terrible intelligence. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. Just as I thought I couldn't go on, I burst into a small clearing and saw a glimmer of hope, an old fire tower perched atop a rocky hill. If I could reach it, maybe I could signal for help, or at least have a defensible position. The climb was agonizing. Every muscle screamed in protest as I scrambled up the steep slope. Behind me I could hear my pursuer, its form changing with each bounding leap. Bear, wolf, mountain lion. It cycled through shapes as it closed the distance. I reached the base of the fire tower and began to climb, the rusted metal rungs creaking ominously under my weight. As I pulled myself onto the platform at the top, I heard a sound that chilled me to my core, my own voice calling up from below. "You can't escape yourself, Charlie," it taunted. "Come down and see what you really are." I slammed the trapdoor shut and huddled in the corner of the small room, praying the ancient structure would keep me safe until help arrived. As night fell once again, a storm rolled in. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark flashes, revealing glimpses of shadowy forms circling the base of the tower. The wind howled, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe it was just the storm I was hearing, not the mocking laughter of the thing below. A particularly violent gust shook the tower, and I heard the ominous sound of metal giving way. With a sickening lurch, the entire structure began to tilt. I had seconds to act. Gripping the railing, I leapt as the tower fell, somehow managing to land on the slope below in a bruised, battered heap. Dazed but knowing I couldn't afford to hesitate, I stumbled down the hill. Through the sheeting rain, I spotted a dark shape that resolved itself into a dilapidated cabin. It was a risk, but with the storm raging and my pursuer surely still out there, I had no choice. The cabin door creaked open at my touch. The interior was a museum of horror, walls covered in frantic writing and crude drawings, shelves lined with jars containing unidentifiable specimens. But it was the table at the center that drew my attention. Spread across it were papers, books, and what looked like a journal. As lightning flashed outside, I began to read. The journal belonged to a researcher who had come to these woods to study local legends. Page after page detailed encounters with a being the locals called a Skinwalker, a shape-shifting creature that could take on the form of animals and people. The final entries became increasingly paranoid, speaking of a growing certainty that the Skinwalker was stalking the researcher, wearing the faces of loved ones to lure them deeper into its territory. The last page simply read, "It's too late for me, but maybe someone will find this and survive. Remember, It can't take a form it hasn't seen. Don't let it see you clearly. And whatever you do, don't let it touch you. A scratching at the door jolted me back to my terrifying reality. I was trapped, with only the ramblings of a doomed researcher for guidance. As the scratching intensified, I realized I would soon come face to face with the nightmare that had been haunting these woods. The door burst open, and there it stood, a nightmare given flesh. In the flickering light of the storm, I saw it cycle through forms rapidly, as if it couldn't decide which would terrify me most. Man, wolf, bear, and things I had no name for, all blended together in a horrifying display. "Charlie," it spoke, and the voice was a chorus. My mother, my father, my own voice, all layered together. "Why do you run from yourself?" I backed away, my hand groping blindly for a weapon, anything to defend myself. "You're not me," I gasped. "You're not anything human." It laughed, the sound like bones splintering. "Human? No, I'm far beyond that limited form. But I could be. I could be anything, everything you ever wanted." As it spoke, its form settled into a shape that made my heart stop. It was me, but an idealized version. Stronger, more confident, unburdened by the fears and insecurities I'd carried all my life. "Join with me," it said, extending a hand. "Let go of your limited human form. Become something greater." For a moment, God help me, I was tempted. But then I remembered the warnings, the fate of the others who had come before me. With a cry of defiance, I swung the lantern I'd found, smashing it into the creature's face. It howled, more in rage than pain, its form rippling as it lost control of the shape it had assumed. I dove past it, out into the storm, knowing the chase was on once again. I ran through the night, through driving rain and howling wind. The Skinwalker was always behind me, sometimes close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck, other times hanging back, toying with me. It called to me with the voices of everyone I'd ever loved, promising comfort, power, an end to loneliness. As the storm began to break and the first light of dawn painted the sky, I found myself back at the trailhead where this nightmare had begun. My car sat there, a beacon of normality and safety. I sprinted towards it, fumbling for my keys. Just as my hand touched the door handle, I felt a presence behind me. Slowly I turned. The Skinwalker stood there, no longer shifting forms, but settling into something ancient and terrible. Its eyes held millennia of hunger and loneliness. "You could stay," it said, and for the first time I heard something like longing in its voice. "You could learn our ways, become like us. Never be alone again." I stared into its eyes, and for a moment I saw the weight of countless years, the pain of an existence spent eternally hunting, eternally hungry, and despite everything I felt a pang of pity. "I'm sorry," I said softly, "but I choose humanity, with all its flaws and limitations." Something like regret flickered in its ancient eyes. Then, faster than I could react, it lunged. I felt a searing pain as claws raked across my arm. I yanked the car door open and threw myself inside, gunning the engine. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The Skinwalker stood at the edge of the forest, watching me go. For a split second, I thought I saw it raise a hand, almost like a farewell. The cut on my arm burned, and as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed within me. The encounter had left its mark, not just physically, but on my very soul. I was alive. I was escaping. But as the forest receded behind me, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a chilling thought. What if I was taking something of the forest, of the Skinwalker, with me? As I merged onto the highway, heading back to the familiar lights of the city, I couldn't help but glance at the deepening shadows between the trees lining the road. And just for a moment I thought I saw something keeping pace with my car, running between the trees with inhuman speed. I pressed the accelerator, pushing the car faster, but I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far or fast I drove, a part of me would always remain back there in those dark woods, locked in an eternal chase with something ancient and hungry. The old truck rattled to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dry dust that swirled lazily in the morning sunlight. Grabbing my worn pack from the passenger seat, I stepped out and stretched, surveying the time-worn trailhead sign. Buckthorn Trail, it read in faded letters, and below that, difficulty, strenuous, recommended for experienced hikers only. I permitted myself a wry smile. If my ex could see me now, she'd surely have some snide remark. Really, Rob, a solo hike? You couldn't even put the toilet seat down reliably. Her scathing final words as she walked out still smoldered in my mind. Well, this would show her, show everyone. Rob Tanner was no soft city boy. Hoisting my pack, I strode purposefully toward the narrow dirt path that snaked into the thick pines. The trail began a gradual ascent, winding through stony outcrops dappled with lichen. A crisp breeze carried the scent of resin and loamy earth, and I breathed deeply, feeling the stress of the past months begin to leach away. This was exactly what I needed. No cell service, no internet, no one to answer to for miles. About an hour in, I paused in a small glade to take a swig from my canteen. It was then I noticed the silence. The chatter of squirrels and chipper bird songs I'd heard earlier had ceased. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. An uneasy prickle crept up my neck. Shaking it off, I pressed on, the trail growing steeper and rockier. Pines towered on all sides like stern sentinels, casting long shadows across the path. Occasionally, I glimpsed flashes of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was never anything there. Just tricks of the light and tired eyes, I told myself. By late afternoon, an unshakable sense of being watched had settled in my gut. Every snapped twig, every rustling branch set my nerves on edge. I found myself whipping around at the slightest sounds, scanning the underbrush. Of course, there was never anyone there. What did I expect to find? Bigfoot? As the shadows lengthened and the light turned to burnished gold, I started scouting for a place to make camp for the night. A promising site appeared just off the trail, a small clear patch beside a tumble of boulders. I unslung my pack and started unloading my tent, and then I saw them. Tracks in the soft dirt at the forest's edge. At first glance they looked canine, a wolf maybe, or a large feral dog. But something was off. They were too elongated, the toes too splayed, and the size, the biggest wolf prints I'd ever seen, were dwarfed by these monstrous impressions. An involuntary shiver ran through me as I crouched for a closer look. That was when I heard it, a long, undulating howl that echoed through the darkening woods and raised every hair on my body. It sounded close, too close. And though I knew it was impossible, some primal instinct screamed that the howl carried an undertone of malicious amusement, as if something out there knew it had me dead to rights. Heart pounding, I snatched up my pack and hurried back to the trail, suddenly wanting nothing more than to put distance between myself and those eerie prints. With fumbling hands, I pulled out my headlamp and switched it on, as full dark fell like a shroud. I quickened my pace, no longer concerned about the noise I was making. Better to risk scaring off some wildlife than to worry about stealth. My headlamp cast a bobbing orb of light that seemed to barely penetrate the pressing gloom. Sweat trickled down my spine despite the deepening night chill. A flash of red. Reflective eyes caught in the beam of my headlamp. Low to the ground, maybe 30 yards off the trail. Adrenaline spiked and I broke into a clumsy run, barking my shins on unseen rocks. The blown leaves rustled behind me, but I didn't dare turn back. I ran until my chest burned and my legs wobbled, finally collapsing against the bole of a massive spruce. In the merciful stillness, I listened for any sound of pursuit, but heard only my own ragged gasps. Wiping clammy hands on my jeans, I glanced at my watch. Not even 8 p.m. I shook my head, a shaky laugh escaping me. 12 hours into a week-long solo hike, and I was already jumping at shadows. Some outdoorsman I was shaping up to be. I gathered myself and stood, righteous anger beginning to burn off the cloying fear. I refused to let my mind play these tricks on me. I was in control out here, and I'd prove it by reaching the end of this trail come hell or high water. With renewed determination, I headed deeper into the waiting forest. Morning brought no relief from the unease that had gripped me the previous night. If anything, the claustrophobic press of the trees and the discordant chitter of hidden birds only amplified my growing paranoia. As I broke camp and set off down the trail once more, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, tracked, hunted. A few miles in, I stumbled across a disturbing sight. More of those strange, elongated prints, but this time with a gruesome addition. The torn and bloodied remains of some unfortunate creature, its ribs splayed to the gray sky like a macabre sculpture. Swallowing back bile, I gave the grisly scene a wide berth. As I walked, I tried to rationalize my fear. Maybe the tracks belonged to a cougar or a bear. But I knew in my bones that no bear or cat had made this kill. The grim precision of it, the wrongness. Lost in dark thoughts, I almost ran headlong into the old-timer. He was standing in the middle of the trail, a weather-beaten walking stick in one gnarled hand. Rheumy eyes studied me from a face creased with age. "You're walking a dark path, son," he said by way of greeting, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. I forced a laugh. "Just a hiking trail, sir. Buckthorn Trail. I'm trying to make it to the end." The old man shook his head slowly. "Buckthorn's got a bad way about it. Twists a man's mind, makes him see things, makes him easy prey." A chill drizzled down my spine. Prey? For what? Things that ain't right, things that ain't natural. He spat into the dirt. "You're better off turning back, boy. This ain't no place for the living." With that cryptic warning, he shouldered past me and shambled off down the trail, leaving me feeling more lost than ever. I stood frozen, wrestling with indecision. Part of me wanted to heed the old-timer, to get off this cursed mountain and never look back, but a larger part, the stubborn part, refused to be cowed by superstitious ramblings. Gritting my teeth, I picked up the trail again, determined to put the strange encounter out of my mind. But as I walked, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something large and tawny slipping through the trees to my right, keeping a pace with me. A deer, maybe, or an elk. I slowed, trying to catch another glimpse, and then I saw it. Not an elk, not even close. The thing moving through the underbrush had the general shape of a deer, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too gaunt, with long, stilt-like legs that moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. And the head. Dear God, the head. I only saw it for a split second before the creature melted into the tree line, but that image will be forever seared behind my eyelids. It was like a deer's skull, stripped of flesh, with cavernous eye sockets that seemed to pull the light from the very air. I ran until my heart felt like it would burst in my chest, ran until the light bled from the sky and true night fell. Only then, huddled against a fell tree and too exhausted to keep moving, did I fully process the gut-wrenching horror of what I'd seen. It had been wearing a deer's face like a grotesque mask, and if it could do that, look like a deer, what else could it mimic? Predators? People? With an icy sickness pooling in my gut, I realized the truth of the old man's words. I was being hunted, stalked by something that could wear any face, any form. Buckthorn Trail had me now, and it wasn't letting go. Darkness fell around me like a death shroud, the shadows between the trees growing deeper and hungrier. I stumbled down the trail with reckless abandon, tripping over tangled roots and deadfall in my haste to put distance between myself and the horror lurking somewhere behind. Time lost all meaning in the gloom. Hours, minutes, days, they all bled together into one pulsing night terror. The only way I marked the passage of time was by the changing timbre of the night sounds around me. The gentle susurrus of dusk insects gradually gave way to the shrieks and howls of midnight predators. But those were welcome, natural noises of a forest going about its grim business. What set my already frayed nerves on edge were the other sounds. Sounds like whispering voices just on the edge of comprehension. Sounds like snapping twigs and rattling branches with no discernible source. Sounds that mimicked the calls of birds and beasts, but with a subtle wrongness, as if run through some demonic filter. Leaves shuffling as if beneath careful plodding feet. The soft slither of something heavy being dragged over dirt and detritus. Each out-of-place noise made me flinch and whirl in a frantic dance, my headlamp beam slashing ineffectual arcs through the impenetrable night. The trail felt endless, winding in drunken switchbacks and making me feel as if I was moving in circles despite my dogged forward motion. Disorientation swirled like a sickness in my gut as the world narrowed to the bobbing pool of light at my feet. And then a sight that made my heart plummet. A backpack dangling forlornly from the branch of a gnarled scrub oak. Its surface was marred with ragged slash marks, as if clawed by some immense beast. Dark stains I refused to acknowledge spackled the shredded fabric. I couldn't suppress a shudder. Another lost soul claimed by Buckthorn's malevolence. An urgent voice in my head screamed to keep moving, to not linger in this cursed place. But as I pressed on, the grisly leavings multiplied. A lone boot, its leather torn and scored, scraps of blood-stiffened flannel fluttering in the branches, and everywhere those monstrous prints in the soft earth, overlapping and merging into a muddy palimpsest of brutality. The remnants of the poor bastards who came before me, now just more detritus rotting beneath the uncaring boughs. Icy tendrils of despair crept through my chest. How was I supposed to survive this when so many others had met a miserable end? The futility of my flight crashed over me in a suffocating wave. But what choice did I have? To simply lay down and let the Buckthorn's horror claim me too? No, I would fight, even if that fight was ultimately useless. Even if I was to be just one more blood-spattered warning sign decorating this wretched trail. Ahead, through a break in the trees, I spied the silver gleam of moonlight on water. A small mountain lake, its surface smooth and glassy in the stillness. Beside it, a flat stretch of shoreline that would make for a defensible campsite. I knew I should push on through the night, should keep placing one foot in front of the other until I simply collapsed. But exhaustion dragged at my bones, and I knew I'd make an even easier target for the stalking entity if I didn't try to refresh myself. With the last reserves of my flagging energy, I shambled toward the lakeshore, praying that the night's reprieve would hold. But even as I fumbled with my tent stakes, a chilling certainty crept over me. This was all just part of the game, the illusion of safety, of rest. I was being toyed with, allowed to hope so that the inevitable fall would be all the more devastating. Out there in the dark, my hunter watched and waited. Night settled over the lake like a silent crypt, the still surface of the water throwing back a distorted reflection of the cloud-scudded moon. I huddled in the meager shelter of my tent, jumping at every night bird's call, every snapping twig. Sleep was an impossible dream. Every time I felt my ragged breathing begin to even out, a fresh wave of icy fear would jolt me back to terrified wakefulness. The darkness outside the thin nylon walls felt alive, malevolent, hungry. As the witching hour crept past, the noises began, at first just more of the same eerie mimicry I'd heard on the trail. Foxes barking with human vocal inflections, owls hooting guttural words in some primordial tongue. The chilling screech of a mountain lion, drawn out into a mocking, ululating wail. But then, a new sound that froze the blood in my veins. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps circling my tent, slow, deliberate, taking their time. Whatever stalked me among the trees had tired of subtlety. Fear rose in my throat, thick and cloying, but beneath it, a simmering anger. How dare this thing toy with me, terrorize me? Newfound fury steadied my hands as I reached for the hunting knife in my pack. The steps paced a steady beat, never approaching closer than a few arm lengths from where I crouched, but never retreating either. I could sense the monumental restraint in that measured distance, the leashed savagery. A low growl shivered the air, rolling across my skin like an icy mist. I tightened my grip on the knife, knuckles white. Let it come. Let this nightmare end one way or the other. The pacing stopped. Silence fell, more terrifying than the echoing snarls. I held my breath, straining my ears against the quiet. Rob. A sibilant whisper right outside the tent flap, but not just any whisper. A voice I knew as well as my own. My ex-wife's voice, the same honey-over-gravel tone that had once set my heart racing in entirely different ways. Rob, why did you leave me? Those painfully familiar cadences but twisted with an undercurrent of malice. Why did you abandon me, Rob? I'm so cold out here. I clapped my hands over my ears, shaking my head frantically as if I could somehow dislodge the insidious whispers. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My ex was hundreds of miles away, probably already shacked up with the new man she'd left me for. This was just another cruel trick, a mind game. But oh God, it sounded so much like her. The same lilting playfulness, the same wry amusement. I'm waiting for you, Rob. Don't you want to keep me warm? Hold me again? Sobs hitched in my chest as I curled into a fetal ball, the knife falling from my nerveless fingers. I couldn't do this, couldn't endure this torture. "Please," I croaked through my tears. "Please, no more." A low chuckle sounded, a grotesque parody of my former wife's laughter. "No more? Oh, baby, we're just getting started." A sudden flurry of motion. My tent quaked as something powerful raked its claws down the sides. I yelped, scrabbling backwards like a crab as those lethal talons shredded the nylon like tissue paper. Through the gaping rents I caught a nauseating glimpse of my tormentor. A hulking, hunchbacked form, its shape never quite resolving into any natural creature. Matted fur mottled with suppurating sores, limbs that bent at unnatural angles, tipped with scything claws. And its face was the worst of all, because it had my ex-wife's face, but stretched and distorted over an inhuman skull, as if it was wearing her skin like an ill-fitting mask. Her pretty features twisted into a parody of a lover's smile. I screamed, and scrabbled for the tent flap, ripping it open and hurling myself blindly into the night. Thorny underbrush tore at my face and arms, but I plunged heedlessly forward. Behind me, an exultant howl shook the forest. The hunt was on once more. Brambles lashed my skin like hungry tongues as I crashed through the underbrush, panic propelling me faster than I'd ever run before. My pursuers' gleeful howls dogged my heels, never falling further behind despite my breakneck pace. Blood pounded in my ears, nearly drowning out the cacophony of nightmares that filled the woods around me. Guttural snarls, snapping jaws, the thunder of feet that fell somewhere between paw and hoof. I didn't dare turn to look, too terrified of what I might see. The forest had become a kaleidoscope of horrors, a twisted shadowland where nothing was as it should be. In the strobing glare of my bouncing headlamp, trees seemed to bend and sway of their own accord, their branches reaching out to snag my clothing like grasping claws. Glowing eyes flickered in the darkness between trunks, there and gone too quickly to be sure if they were real or just figments of my unraveling mind. Shapes slunk through the underbrush at the edges of my vision, never quite resolving into identifiable forms. Was that a bear, or something wearing a bear's skin like a grotesque costume? Were those wolves loping alongside me, or twisted mockeries of wolves, their proportions subtly wrong? I no longer knew what was real and what was just the product of my spiraling terror. The only certainty was the burning in my legs and lungs, and the implacable pursuit of the nightmare creatures behind me. In my haste, I stumbled over a rot-slick log. I hit the ground hard, the sharp tang of blood filling my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. For one heart-stopping moment, I was sure it was over. I braced myself for the feeling of fangs and claws sinking into my flesh, tearing me apart as I'd seen done to those poor doomed creatures that came before me. But the death blow never fell. Instead, as I lay there panting and trembling, I heard a sound that chilled me more than any snarl or roar ever could. Laughter. Human laughter, but warped and twisted into a sound no sane person would ever make. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing wearing my ex-wife's face crouched at the edge of the trail, its form shifting and rippling like water. One moment it was almost human, a grotesque perversion of the woman I'd once loved. The next it was a hulking, long-limbed abomination that defied description. But the worst part was the knowing gleam in its eyes, the perverse intelligence. This was no mere animal, driven by instinct and hunger. There was a malevolent sentience behind those oil-black orbs, a cruel amusement at my terror and despair. It tilted its head, a sickeningly familiar gesture rendered obscene by the thing's distorted anatomy. When it spoke, it was with my ex's voice, but overlaid with a guttural growl that no human throat could ever produce. "Run, little rabbit," it crooned, razor teeth glinting in a parody of a smile. "Run and let us chase. The fear makes the meat so much sweeter." A sob caught in my chest as I scrabbled backwards, hardly feeling the rocks and sticks that gouged my palms. The thing threw back its head and laughed again, the sound echoing off the trees. All around, its shadowy brethren took up the call, yips and howls and screeches melding into a frenzied chorus. I lurched to my feet, adrenaline overpowering my exhaustion, and plunged back into the trees. The hunt was on again, my suffering the night's entertainment for these sadistic horrors. I could only pray that when they tired of their sport, my end would be swift. But something told me these creatures savored cruelty just as much as the thrill of pursuit. Gasping for breath, Eyes blurred with tears of terror and despair, I fled deeper into the hungry dark, my tormentor's howls never far behind. Time lost all meaning as I stumbled through the night-shrouded forest. Minutes, hours, and eternity. They all bled together in one endless, nightmarish fever dream. The only constants were the burn of my overtaxed muscles, the knife-edged chill of the pre-dawn air in my lungs, and the unrelenting presence of my pursuers. They toyed with me, never quite allowing me to pull ahead, but never closing for the kill either. Always just on the cusp of my perceptions, shadows within shadows and terrors cloaked in fearsome obscurity. Now and then they would let loose with those awful, warped parodies of human speech, taunting me with the voices of loved ones as they drove me ever onward. Just when I was sure I would drop from sheer exhaustion, a miraculous sight pierced the gloom ahead. A light. The warm, steady glow of a lamp shining through a small cabin window. I staggered up the creaking steps of the cabin's sagging porch, hardly daring to believe my salvation could be so close at hand. The light I had seen shining through the trees like a beacon of hope was even brighter up close, spilling warmly from a single small window. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle, exhaustion and relief making my movements clumsy. But just as my fingertips brushed the rusted metal, a sound from inside froze me in my tracks. A low, wet, rattling breath like air being sucked through a throat full of blood. Ice flooded my veins. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I leaned forward to peer through the grime-streaked window. At first I could make out only vague shapes in the dim light. A rickety table. The hunched silhouette of a figure slumped in a chair, scattered detritus littering the floor. But as my eyes adjusted, the grisly details emerged like figures from a fog. The floor wasn't strewn with mere trash, but with bones. Rib cages and femurs, gnawed scraps of hide and fur, rotting viscera glistening wetly in the lantern light. It was a charnel house, a monument to gluttony and savagery, and there, presiding over it all from its throne of splintered wood and tattered cloth, was the monster. My monster. The thing that had stalked and tormented me, wearing a new face for every fresh hell it put me through. But now, in this putrid sanctum, it wore no mask. Its true form was revealed in all its grotesque, sanity-shattering glory. A monstrous amalgamation of man and beast, patched together from a dozen different creatures. Matted fur and scabrous flesh stretched over misshapen limbs. A lupine snout snapped and slavered above a bare, humanoid chest. Antlers rose in a twisted crown from a skull that bulged and dipped in all the wrong places. And its eyes, dear God, its eyes, pitiless black orbs that swallowed the light and promised only agony. They turned to me as I stood transfixed by the window, and in their depths I saw the final guttering of my own dwindling hope. There would be no rescue, no salvation, only the inexorable rending of fang and claw. The thing rose from its chair with a fluid, boneless grace that sent revulsion shuddering through me. I stood rooted in place, limbs leaden with terror, as it slunk towards the door. The knob began to turn with agonizing slowness, squealing in protest. From the misshapen throat came a sound that might have been a chuckle or a sob, rendered in the voice of my ex-wife. "I told you, Rob, we're just getting started." The door slammed open, a rank gust of rotting meat, claws scrabbling on aged wood. And then it was on me, all snapping jaws and grasping limbs, a whirlwind of pain and terror. I barely had time to scream before its bulk crushed the air from my lungs, and stars exploded across my vision. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was its fetid breath hissing against my ear, and the guttural rasp of a voice that had once whispered love, now promising only eternal suffering. "Welcome home, dear." I came back to myself slowly, the shredded wisps of consciousness knitting together strand by agonizing strand. At first I was aware only of the pain, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to suffuse every cell of my battered body. Then other sensations intruded, the musty stench of old blood and decay, the tacky slide of congealing fluids against my skin, a deep, pervading cold that seemed to radiate from my core. With a titanic effort, I forced my crusted eyes open, only to immediately wish I hadn't. I was splayed on the floor of the ramshackle cabin, a macabre collage of gore decorating the rough planks around me. My blood, I realized dimly. So much blood. In the gray half-light of early dawn filtering through the grimy windows, I could see ragged furrows scoring my chest and arms where claws had peeled back skin and muscle. But I was alive. Somehow, impossibly, I was still breathing, each hitching gasp sending fresh ripples of agony through my mangled frame. Alone, too. Of the foul creature that had brought me to this charnel pit, there was no sign. Gingerly, I levered myself to a sitting position, fighting back a surge of bile as the movement sent the room spinning. I had to get out of here, find help, before the beast returned to finish its work. But how far could I feasibly drag my savaged carcass through unforgiving wilderness? My gaze fell on an old table pushed up against the far wall, its surface strewn with crumpled papers and yellowing tomes. Gritting my teeth, I crawled toward it, each inch a mile of pain. The pages were filled with cramped, spidery script, interspersed with crude sketches of grotesque figures, mid-transformation between human and beast. With trembling fingers, I smoothed out one of the fragile sheets. "Skinwalker," read the faded headline, the antique typeface spattered with ancient bloodstains. My eyes skipped down the page, phrases leaping out like gibbering specters. Shape-shifting witches, take the form of animals, feed on terror and suffering. Adrenaline coursed through me in a sickening flood. I knew what it was now, the thing that had stalked me, tortured me. I had a name to put to the nightmares that would forever haunt me, waking and sleeping. But with that knowledge came the grim realization that my ordeal was far from over. According to the moldering texts, skinwalkers rarely left their prey alive, and even if I escaped these woods, even if I put miles and years between myself and this night of horrors, I would never truly be free. I would always be looking over my shoulder, jumping at every errant shadow, waiting for the day when a familiar voice called out to me from the darkness, and a creature wearing a loved one's skin slunk from the trees to reclaim me for its sadistic games. A shudder rippled through me that had little to do with my wounds. For the first time, I understood the true depths of the skinwalker's cruelty. It hadn't just ravaged my body. It had shattered my mind, my soul, and left me forever in fragments. But I couldn't succumb to despair. Not yet. Not while I still drew breath, however ragged and rattling. With a Herculean effort, I dragged myself upright, leaning heavily on the ancient table. One step, then another. Each movement was agony, but I welcomed the pain. It meant I was still alive, still fighting. Inch by tortuous inch, I staggered to the door and out into the pale dawn light. Maybe it was futile. Maybe there was no escape. Not really. But I had to try. For the sake of the man I was before this night. For the sake of the broken thing I would be after. I fixed my eyes on the lightening horizon, a distant point to stagger toward. Behind me I could hear rustling in the underbrush, sly and patient. It would be back. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but one day. And when it came wearing my face or some other's, I would finally surrender to its fathomless hunger. I would become one more lost soul haunting the forests of Buckthorn Trail. But until then, I would walk, I would crawl, and I would carry the scars, seen and unseen, as a wordless testament to the night I gazed into the eyes of a monster and glimpsed the endless dark that waits for us all. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as I stepped out of my beat-up Jeep Wrangler at the remote trailhead. Sweat already trickled down my neck, staining the collar of my faded flannel shirt. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat, double-checking that I had all the essentials. Water, protein bars, flashlight, pocket knife, first aid kit. The usual supplies for a day hike in the Coconino National Forest. Hiking was my escape, a way to quiet the constant chatter in my head. Out here among the Ponderosa Pines and Red Rock Canyons, my problems back in Flagstaff seemed to shrink, fading away like a mirage. The steady rhythm of boots on dirt, the burn of the sun and strain in my legs had a way of purifying me, stripping away stress until only the naked core of my being remained. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 32 years old, an English teacher by trade. For the past 5 years, I've taught literature and creative writing at Flagstaff High School. It's a good job, stable, but after a few years, the daily grind of lesson planning and grading essays started to wear on me. I felt trapped, fenced in by fluorescent lights and cafeteria green walls. That's when I rediscovered my childhood love of hiking and being outside. Growing up, my dad used to take me and my little sister camping in these same forests. We'd spend weekends pitching a tent, fishing in clear mountain streams, telling ghost stories around the campfire. Those trips were some of the happiest memories of my life. After Dad passed away from a heart attack 3 years ago, I found myself returning again and again to these familiar trails. It was a way to reconnect with him, to find solace as I grieved. What started as occasional day hikes soon turned into an obsession. Every weekend and school break I was out here, testing my endurance on increasingly remote and challenging trails. Which is how I found myself at this lonely trailhead, 2 hours north of Flagstaff, on a crisp October morning. A buddy of mine from the local hiking club had told me about this place. "It's incredible," Orson had said, his eyes lighting up with contagious enthusiasm, like something out of a fantasy novel. "But it's no joke, man. That trail is the real deal. You sure you're ready for it?" I had shrugged off his warning with a grin. After tackling most of the established routes in Coconino, I was eager for something that would push me to my limits. According to Orson, this trail wasn't even on most official maps, a true wilderness experience. "Just keep your wits about you out there," Orson had said as we pored over topos at his kitchen table. "Weird stuff happens in those woods. I've heard stories." At the time, I had laughed and shook my head. I wasn't the superstitious type. But now, as I stood at the edge of the dense tree line, Orson's words echoed in my mind. An uneasiness crept over me, raising the hairs on my forearms. It was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and the eerie silence of the forest. The sooner I got moving, the better. I locked up the Jeep, shouldered my pack, and set off down the faint trail. The sound of my footsteps was quickly swallowed by the trees. Little did I know that Orson's warning would prove all too accurate, that this trail would lead me into the heart of a nightmare, and that in just a few hours I would come face to face with something that would shatter my notions of reality itself. The first mile of the trail meandered through a tranquil ponderosa pine forest. Sunlight filtered down through the dense canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air was rich with the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. Aside from the occasional bird call and the crunch of my footsteps, the woods were still. About 40 minutes in, I reached a small clearing. A sense of unease bloomed in my gut as I stepped out from under the trees. Something felt off about this place, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The clearing was unremarkable, just a rough circle of bare earth and scraggly grass ringed by towering ponderosas. But the silence here was different, heavier somehow. I knelt down to retie my bootlace, and that's when I noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked like deer prints, 2 tear-shaped impressions side by side, but as I examined them closer, a chill ran down my spine. They were too big for one thing, almost twice the size of any mule deer track I'd ever seen. And instead of the neat, cloven hooves of a deer, these prints had long, splayed toes tipped with jagged claw marks. What kind of animal made tracks like that? My mind flipped through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, elk, but none quite matched. Unnerved, I glanced around the clearing again. Now that I looked closer, I could see more of the bizarre prints. They crisscrossed the clearing in a chaotic tangle, as if whatever creature made them had been pacing restlessly back and forth. A twig snapped at the edge of the clearing, and I practically jumped out of my skin. Heart pounding, I peered into the shadowy tree line. For a split second, I glimpsed a flicker of brown fur between the tree trunks. Deer, maybe? But no, the shape was wrong, almost ape-like in the way it moved. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin and reedy to my own ears. "Is someone there?" Silence. Even the birds had gone quiet. Suddenly eager to be back under the shelter of the trees, I hurried to the opposite side of the clearing. The trail here was fainter, more overgrown. As I plunged back into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made those tracks, whatever I had seen in the trees, was now behind me, watching. I quickened my pace, boots thudding against the packed dirt. Just get to the overlook, I told myself. Get your head out of this Blair Witch Project bullshit and enjoy the damn hike. About 10 minutes later, I rounded a switchback and almost ran smack into an old man in a battered ranger hat. He was gaunt and grizzled, with a salt and pepper beard and deep creases around his eyes. A wooden walking stick was clutched in one gnarled hand. "Whoa there, son," he exclaimed, grabbing my shoulder to steady us both. "What's your rush? You're liable to barrel right off a cliff moving that fast." "Sorry," I gasped, catching my breath. I thought I saw something. Back there in the clearing." His blue eyes sharpened and he glanced past me, back the way I had come. When he spoke again, his voice was low and serious. "Was it a deer? Folks do see deer out here, although—" He paused, squinting at me from under the brim of his hat. "Judging by that look on your face, I'd wager it weren't no deer you saw." I shook my head. "I don't know what it was, not a deer, that's for sure. And there were these weird tracks." I trailed off, feeling foolish. What was I saying? That I'd seen Bigfoot out there? The old man just nodded like he'd heard it all before. "Aye, there's more out in these woods than the rangers like to admit. More than you'd find in those fancy guidebooks. My people, the Dine, we have stories of creatures older than the trees." He shrugged. "Most folks nowadays, they don't believe. But the old ones, they know." An icy ripple worked its way down my back. The way he said creatures in that matter-of-fact tone made them feel all too real. And what did he mean by the old ones? "What kinds of creatures?" I asked. He gave me a long, appraising look. "The kind that can wear many skins, the kind that hunger after human flesh, the kind that maybe you caught a glimpse of back in that clearing." My mouth went dry. He couldn't possibly mean— "Skinwalkers," he said, as if reading my mind. "The witches who walk like beasts. That's what you saw, boy. And if you're smart, you'll turn around right now and walk out of this forest. Walk and don't look back." With that, he pushed past me and continued down the trail, his walking stick tapping an irregular rhythm against the stones. In seconds, he had vanished into the trees like a ghost. I stood rooted in place, my mind spinning. Skinwalkers? Witches? That was just folklore, Native American legend. It couldn't be real. And yet, those uncanny tracks, that flicker of fur and sinew between the trees, moving with a gait that was almost human. A chill wind whipped through the forest, carrying with it the scent of something feral and musky. In the distance, something howled, an unearthly sound that was almost but not quite like a coyote. I shuddered. Overhead, the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. If I didn't get moving soon, I'd be hiking back out in the dark. Resolutely, I pushed the old man's cryptic warning to the back of my mind and struck off down the trail. The overlook Orson had described to me couldn't be much farther. I'd take in the view, catch my breath, then head back the way I came. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel the forest closing in around me. The pines seemed to lean closer, their needles brushing my face and arms like probing fingers. Every rustle of leaves, every skitter of pebbles made me flinch and peer into the lengthening shadows. I was jumping at ghosts, I admonished myself. And then I heard it. A guttural grunt, half animal and half human, drifting from somewhere off to my left. I froze, scanning the trees. There, crouched on a fallen log maybe 30 feet from the trail, was a figure. At first my brain tried to parse it as a bear. It had the same hulking, shaggy form, the same round ears and long snout. But even as I stared, that snout seemed to shorten and flatten. The creature slowly stood up on two legs, and I saw its front limbs elongate grotesquely, saw its paws lengthen into almost hand-like appendages. In the dying light, its fur looked black, but as I watched in horror, brown patches appeared as if rising to the surface of its pelt. A pair of red-rimmed eyes met mine. This was no bear. It wasn't any animal I had ever seen or believed existed. The wrongness of it, the unnaturalness, paralyzed me with primal fear. A low growl rumbled from its barrel chest, a sound felt more than heard. Then the creature reared back its head and screamed. It was a raw, warbling cry, a twisted parody of a human voice. It raised every hair on my body and turned my guts to ice water. The scream broke the spell holding me in place. I bolted, running full tilt down the trail with no thought but to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Branches whipped my face and stones rolled under my boots, but I didn't slow. From behind me came the sound of heavy footfalls, of something large and loping and hungry giving chase. I no longer cared about the overlook, about seeing the sunset. I needed to get out of these woods now while I still could. As I ran, the old man's words echoed in my head with damning certainty. Skinwalkers, the witches who walk like beasts. Too late I knew he had spoken the truth, and too late I feared for me. My lungs burned and my legs ached as I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that clawed at my face and arms. Behind me I could hear the creature's relentless pursuit, its heavy footfalls growing closer with each passing second. In my panic, I had veered off the main trail, plunging into the dense heart of the forest. The trees here grew so closely together that their canopies blotted out the sky, casting everything in a premature twilight. I had no idea where I was or which direction I was running. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to somehow escape the nightmare that stalked me. But I was only human, and my body had limits. My foot caught on a gnarled root and I went sprawling, my knee striking a rock with a sickening crack. Pain lanced through my leg and I cried out, struggling to get back to my feet. In that moment, the forest went deathly silent. Even the creature's footsteps had stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear over the frantic pounding of my heart. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity, and then, from somewhere far too close, came a low, guttural growl. It was a sound of anticipation, of hunger. I could feel the creature's presence like a physical weight, could smell its rank, musky odor. Bile rose in my throat, and I scrambled backwards, my injured leg dragging uselessly. My back hit the rough bark of a tree, and I realized with sinking certainty that I was trapped. This was it. This was how I would die, torn apart by some impossible beast in a forest that no longer felt like my sanctuary. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting to see the death blow coming. But instead of the expected agony of claws and teeth, I heard a clack of stones, like something hard striking the ground. Then another and another coming from all around me. It sounded almost like footsteps, like dozens of invisible feet marching through the trees. My eyes flew open and I stared wildly into the gloom. At first I saw nothing. Then gradually, shapes began to resolve out of the shadows. They were human shapes, but there was something profoundly wrong about the way they moved, the way their limbs bent at unnatural angles. As they drew closer, I could see that their skin had a grayish, mottled appearance, like fungus growing on a corpse. The figures formed a loose circle around me, their movements jerky and erratic. I counted at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They were close enough now that I could see their faces, and immediately wished I hadn't. Their features were distorted, stretched and sagging as if their bones had partially liquefied. Their eyes were sunken black pits, their mouths gaping maws filled with jagged teeth. They were like walking dead, animated by some dark and twisted force. And in the center of the circle, standing head and shoulders taller than the rest, was the creature from the trail. In the half-light filtering through the trees, I could see it more clearly now. It had a vaguely humanoid shape, but its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long, its torso too lean and sinewy. Tufts of coarse black hair sprouted from its leathery skin, but it was the face that truly horrified me. It was caught somewhere between human and animal, the features flowing and changing even as I watched. One moment it had the snout and fangs of a wolf, the next the hooked beak of a bird of prey. And through all the transformations, those red-rimmed eyes remained locked on mine, blazing with a feral, predatory intelligence. The creature took a step forward, its clawed hands flexing. The shambling figures around me mirrored its movement, tightening the circle. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They had me cornered like a wounded animal. A choked sob escaped my throat. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice cracking with terror. The creature cocked its head as if considering the question. When it spoke, its voice was a rasping growl that sounded like it was being dragged over razor blades. "Hungry," it said, baring its fangs in a ghastly approximation of a smile. "We hungry." The figures around me took up the chant, their voices a guttural, mindless chorus. "Hungry, hungry, hungry." They began to advance, their arms outstretched, their bony fingers grasping. In that moment, something deep inside me hardened into resolve. If I was going to die here, I would die fighting. I would make these monsters work for their meal. I pushed myself to my feet, ignoring the white-hot agony in my knee. My hand scrabbled along the ground until it closed around a thick, sturdy branch. I brandished it in front of me like a club, trying to ignore how badly my hands were shaking. "Stay back," I warned, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I'm warning you." The creatures laughed, a sound like rotting leaves skittering across a tomb. They knew and I knew that my makeshift weapon was useless against them, but it was all I had. The leader of the pack crouched, preparing to spring. I braced myself, my grip tightening on the branch. In my head I began to pray, begging for a miracle I knew wouldn't come. And then, incredibly, it did. A long, piercing howl split the air so loud that it seemed to shake the very trees. The creatures froze, their heads swiveling towards the sound. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then the leader let out a snarl of frustration and twisted its body in a way that should have been impossible. Bones cracked and realigned, flesh rippled and flowed, and suddenly a massive black wolf stood where the creature had been. With a howl of its own, it bounded off into the trees, swiftly vanishing into the shadows. As if released from a spell, the other creatures scatter as well, their misshapen forms melting away until only the ordinary twilight of the forest remained. In seconds, it was as if they had never been there at all. I stood there, branch still raised, my chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline. I half expected the creatures to reappear, to finish what they started. But as the minutes ticked by and the forest remained still, I began to let myself believe that the danger had truly passed. My whole body started to tremble as the surge of fear and survival instinct drained away, leaving me hollow and wrung out. The branch slipped from my nerveless fingers and I slumped against the tree, my injured leg finally giving out beneath me. I had survived. Through luck or divine intervention, I had escaped being devoured by those things. But I was still lost, still injured, and night was falling fast. I had no food, no shelter, and only a little water left in my canteen. And somewhere out in those darkening woods I knew, the Skinwalkers still lurked. They had let me go for now, but for how long? How long before they caught my scent again and resumed their hungry hunt? Gritting my teeth against the pain, I forced myself back to my feet and began to limp deeper into the forest. I needed to find some place to hole up for the night, some place defensible, and I needed to pray that dawn would come before the monsters did. As I stumbled through the gathering dark, one thought kept circling in my exhausted, terrified mind. I never should have come to these woods alone. I don't know how long I stumbled through the woods in the dark, my injured leg sending bolts of agony through me with every step. The forest had become a labyrinth of shadows and eerie silhouettes, every tree a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a fresh jolt of fear. Finally, when I felt I could go no further, I spotted a dark shape jutting up from the forest floor ahead. As I drew closer, I realized it was an old cabin, long abandoned by the look of it. The roof sagged and the walls were covered in a patchwork of moss and lichen, but it seemed sturdy enough. I limped up the creaking steps and tried the door. To my relief, it swung open with a groan of rusted hinges. I peered into the gloom, my heart in my throat, half expecting to see those nightmare creatures waiting for me. But the single room was empty, filled with nothing but dust and cobwebs. I stepped inside, shutting the door firmly behind me. Pale moonlight filtered in through gaps in the time-worn roof, casting the room in a ghostly half-light. Water stains and graffiti marred the walls, and the floor was littered with old beer cans, yellowing newspapers, and other detritus of human presence long gone. In the far corner I spotted an old wood-burning stove, a stack of firewood still piled neatly beside it. In that moment, the prospect of warmth and light seemed like the most beautiful thing in the world. I lurched across the room, ignoring the spiderwebs that clung to my face and arms, and dropped to my knees beside the stove. My hands shook as I piled the dry wood inside and fumbled in my pocket for my lighter. It took 3 tries before the kindling caught, the small flames quickly licking up the sides of the logs. As the fire grew, its warm light filled the small room, pushing back the darkness and the chill that had seeped into my bones. I huddled as close to the stove as I could, trying to still my chattering teeth. Exhaustion washed over me, the events of the day catching up all at once. But even as my body cried out for rest, my mind refused to settle. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind through the trees outside made me twitch and whirl around, convinced the Skinwalkers had found me. At some point I must have drifted off into a fitful doze, because I woke with a start to find the fire burned down to glowing embers. And I wasn't alone. They stood at the edges of the dying firelight, half hidden in shadow. At first I thought they were more of the corpse creature from the forest, but as my eyes adjusted I realized they were human, or at least they had been once. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all Native American by the look of their features. They wore ragged, old-fashioned clothing, flannel shirts, faded jeans, scuffed boots, but it was their eyes that made my breath catch in my throat. They were filled with a hollow, haunted look, an echo of unimaginable suffering. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and reedy in my ears. "What do you want?" The woman stepped forward, her long black hair hanging lank around her face. When she spoke, her voice was a dry whisper, like dead leaves skittering across stone. "We were like you once," she said. "We came to these woods seeking solace, seeking peace, but we found only hunger and shadow." One of the men nodded, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "The Skinwalkers," he said. "They caught our scent, just as they've caught yours. They chased us, tormented us, and when they caught us—" He trailed off, his face twisting with remembered agony. The other man picked up the thread. "They devoured us," he said flatly. "Not just our flesh, but our souls. They trapped us in this in-between place, not alive but not allowed to rest." A chill worked its way down my spine as understanding dawned. These weren't just ghosts. They were warnings, omens of the fate that awaited me if the Skinwalkers had their way. "How do I stop them?" I asked, desperation cracking my voice. "How do I escape this?" The woman shook her head sadly. "There is no escape," she whispered. "They are ancient, powerful. They are the hunger that stalks the shadows of men's hearts. All you can do is run, and pray they do not catch you." With those words, the 3 shades began to fade, their forms growing transparent until they vanished like mist beneath the morning sun. I was alone again, with only the pop and hiss of the embers for company. I sat there for a long moment, numb with a drowning sense of hopelessness. Then, slowly, a fragile spark of defiance kindled in my chest. No, I refused to accept that there was no way out of this nightmare. I refused to end up like those poor, trapped souls. I would find a way to banish these monsters back to whatever dark place had spawned them. I would walk out of this forest alive and whole. But first, I needed to survive the night. I forced my aching body to move, gathering more firewood and piling it high in the stove. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since before dawn. I dug through my pack, hoping against hope that I had something, anything, to eat. My heart leapt as my hand closed around a granola bar at the very bottom, slightly crushed but still wrapped. I tore into it ravenously, hardly tasting it as I devoured it in 3 bites. It wasn't much, but it was enough to quiet the worst of my hunger pangs. I was just washing down the last dry crumbs with a swig from my canteen when I heard it, a sound from just outside the cabin's single grimy window, a soft, almost thoughtful tapping, as of claws against glass. Every muscle in my body seized with instinctive terror. I turned my head slowly, feeling like I was moving through molasses. There, pressed against the pane, was a face out of my darkest nightmares. It had the broad, sloping forehead and elongated jaws of a wolf, but the eyes that stared in at me were horribly, unnaturally human. They glinted with a malevolent intelligence as they met mine. Then the jaws parted in a leering grin, revealing rows of jagged yellow fangs. Little pig, let me in," the creature crooned, its voice a guttural parody of the old nursery rhyme. As it spoke, I saw its form ripple and change, the fur receding, the bones of its face rearranging themselves with a sick, fluid grace. A heartbeat later, a man's face leered in at me, twisted with cruel amusement. But the eyes, those terrible knowing eyes, remained the same. "You can't hide from us in there forever," the Skinwalker taunted. "Sooner or later hunger will draw you out, or maybe we'll just come in and pluck you out like a juicy little oyster from its shell, It threw its head back and laughed, and the sound was like ice water trickling down my spine. Then it turned and loped away into the night, leaving me alone with my hammering heart and the certain knowledge that this respite was only temporary. They were out there in the darkness, waiting for me. It was only a matter of time before they made good on their threats. I sank down beside the stove, burying my face in my hands as hopelessness crashed over me in a suffocating wave. What was I going to do? How was I going to get out of this? I had never felt so alone, so utterly cut off from everything safe and sane. In that moment I would have given anything, done anything, just to see a friendly human face, to hear a kind word. But there was no one. There was only me, the cabin, the dying fire, and the hungry things in the dark, drawing ever closer. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was sit there in the guttering firelight and wait for the horrors to come. And in the distance, drifting on the chill night wind, I heard the howls of the Skinwalkers, calling to each other, and to me. A shudder racked my frame. It was going to be a very long night. I must have slept despite the terror coursing through my veins, because I woke to pale sunlight filtering in through the cabin's grimy windows. For a moment I lay there, blinking confusedly, my mind fogged with the vague memory of troubled dreams. Then the events of the previous day came crashing back, and I jolted upright, heart pounding. The cabin was quiet, the fire in the stove long dead. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, only the gentle creak of the old timbers settling and the distant chirping of birds. Birds. Relief flooded through me at that ordinary, blessed sound. If the birds were singing, then surely the Skinwalkers must be gone, right? Monsters like that couldn't abide anything so pure and innocent. I levered myself painfully to my feet, my muscles stiff and aching from a night spent huddled on the hard floor. My knee throbbed where I'd banged it yesterday, but when I tested my weight on it, it held. It wasn't comfortable, but I could walk. That was all that mattered. I gathered my meager belongings, repacked my bag, and stepped cautiously to the door. I eased it open a crack, half expecting a claw-tipped hand to come bursting through and seize me. But there was only the quiet forest, mist curling between the trees, dew glinting on the underbrush. I slipped outside, never taking my eyes off the tree line. The morning air was cool and damp, heavy with the loamy scent of leaves and earth. It felt good in my lungs after the dusty staleness of the cabin. I scanned the ground, looking for tracks, any sign that my tormentors had lingered nearby, but I saw nothing. Slowly, hardly daring to hope, I started off into the trees, aiming myself in the direction I prayed would take me back to civilization. If I could just make it to the trailhead, to my jeep. I'd been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere off to my left. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It could have been an animal, I told myself, a deer or a squirrel. Not every sound in these woods was a threat. But then I heard another noise, this time from my right, the unmistakable rustle of something large pushing through the brush, something bipedal. Fear rose in me like a black wave, and I started to run, all thought of stealth forgotten. Heavy footfalls echoed behind me, quickly joined by others. They were coming for me, just like they had promised. The hunt was on. Low branches whipped at my face, and thorny underbrush tore at my legs as I ran, my heart galloping like a runaway horse in my chest. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the woods, their excited panting and occasional howls spurring me to greater speeds, but I knew I couldn't outrun them, not in their domain. They were toying with me like a pack of wolves harrying a wounded deer. They would run me to exhaustion, waiting for me to stumble, to falter, and then they would have me. As if summoned by that grim thought, my bad knee chose that moment to give out, sending me sprawling face first into the dirt. I scrambled to get up, spitting leaves and loam, but it was too late. They were upon me. I rolled onto my back, determined to face my end with some shred of defiance, and found myself staring up at the grizzled face of the old Native American man from the trail yesterday. He stood over me, a gnarled walking stick in one hand, the other held out in a gesture of peace. "Easy there, boy," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "You're safe now." I gaped at him, my mind struggling to make sense of this sudden turn. Behind him I saw two younger Native American men, tall and muscular, cradling old hunting rifles. Their eyes scanned the trees as they took up protective positions on either side of me. "What? How?" I stammered, struggling to sit up. "The Skinwalkers. They were chasing me." The old man nodded grimly. "I know. We've been tracking them since dawn. Heard them howling in the night and knew some poor fool was in trouble. He extended a hand, hauling me to my feet with surprising strength. Up close, I could see the deep lines etched into his weathered face, the wisdom of years in his dark eyes. "You're lucky we found you," he said. "Luckier still that the Skinwalkers like to play with their food. Gives us a chance to even the odds a bit." One of the younger men, his long black hair tied back in a ponytail, grunted agreement. "They're not going to give up, Uncle," he said. "Not now that they've got the scent." The old man sighed. "No, they won't, which means we need to get this one out of here fast, before they regroup." He turned back to me, appraising me with a critical eye. "Can you walk, boy? We've got a bit of a hike ahead of us." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The adrenaline was starting to drain away, leaving me lightheaded and shaky. The other young man, who had a jagged scar down one cheek, stepped forward and handed me a canteen. "Drink," he said. "Keep your strength up. We'll need to move quickly." I took the canteen with mumbled thanks and gulped the water greedily. It was lukewarm and tasted of metal, but in that moment it was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted. The old man was studying the trees, his brow furrowed. "They won't stay away for long," he said. "We need to get moving. Stick close and do exactly as I say, understand?" I nodded again, handing the canteen back to Scar. The old man set off through the trees at a brisk pace, the two younger men falling in behind him. I scrambled to keep up, my exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected rescue. We walked in silence for a time, the only sounds the crunch of our footsteps and the distant calls of birds. But beneath the ordinary noises of the forest, I thought I could hear something else. A rustling, a panting, just at the edge of hearing. The Skinwalkers, shadowing us, waiting for their moment to strike. The old man must have heard it too, because he picked up the pace, his jaw set in a grim line. The trail began to climb, switchbacking up the side of a steep hill. My lungs burned and my legs trembled with fatigue, but I pushed on, driven by a desperate need to escape these nightmare woods. We were nearing the top of the hill when Scar, who'd been bringing up the rear, let out a sharp cry. I whirled around to see a dark shape burst out of the underbrush and tackle him to the ground. They rolled together down the hill, snarling and snapping like two wild animals. "Keep going!" the old man shouted, shoving me forward. "We're almost there!" Torn between terror and the urge to help, I hesitated for a fatal second. In that moment, a heavy weight slammed into my back, sending me sprawling. Sharp claws dug into my shoulders as a rank, fetid breath washed over me. I screamed, thrashing wildly, but the Skinwalker on my back only growled and tightened its grip. I felt its jaws close around the back of my neck, needle-sharp teeth dimpling my skin. And then suddenly the weight was gone, flung away by a powerful blow. I looked up to see Ponytail standing over me, the butt of his rifle still raised from where he had smashed it into the creature's head. He reached down and hauled me upright, pushing me ahead of him. "Go, run!" I ran, half stumbling up the last few yards to the top of the hill. The crest was rocky and bare, devoid of trees, and there, crouched in the center like a great stone beast, was a low circular structure built of rough-hewn logs. Smoke curled from a hole in the center of its domed roof. The old man was waiting by the entrance, waving me frantically forward. "Inside, quickly!" I didn't hesitate, plunging into the dim interior of the structure. The old man and Ponytail squeezed in after me, slamming and barring the heavy wooden door behind us. For a moment we stood there in the smoky gloom, chests heaving, listening to the frustrated snarls and scratches of the Skinwalkers outside. Then the old man straightened up, squaring his shoulders. "Welcome," he said with a wry twist of his lips, "to the last stronghold of the Dying against the darkness. This is where we make our stand." I looked around, taking in the ancient wall hangings, the bundles of herbs and fetishes hanging from the ceiling, the central fire pit that filled the room with dancing light and shadows. And for the first time since I'd set foot in these woods, I felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. We weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. I could still hear the Skinwalkers outside, circling, probing for weakness. They wouldn't give up easily, I knew that now. But we weren't alone anymore either. And in this place of power, with these men who knew the enemy we faced, perhaps we had a chance after all. A chance to face the darkness head on and maybe, just maybe, to win. The old man, who introduced himself as John Blackfeather, wasted no time. As soon as the door was barred, he began issuing orders to his nephews in clipped, urgent tones. They scurried to obey, clearing a space in the center of the floor, fetching bundles of dried herbs and strange-looking talismans from the shadowed recesses of the hogan. As they worked, Blackfeather explained the nature of our foe. The Skinwalkers, he said, were once men, evil witches who had gained supernatural power through unspeakable acts. They could take the form of any animal, or even mimic specific people to lure their victims. They are the ultimate violators of the natural order, Blackfeather said, his face grim in the flickering firelight. They kill not for food or survival, but for power. Every life they take makes them stronger. Outside, the Skinwalkers prowled restlessly, their occasional snarls and yowls sending shivers down my spine. Every so often there was a thud against the walls, as if they were testing the strength of our defenses. The younger men, whose names I learned were David and Joseph, took up positions on either side of the door, rifles at the ready. Blackfeather drew me into the center of the room, where a complex pattern had been traced on the floor in some kind of pale sand. "This is a ritual circle," he explained, his voice low and intense. "A sacred space where the powers of the spirit world can be called upon. It is our only hope of defeating these monsters." He had me sit cross-legged at the heart of the circle, then began chanting in a language I didn't recognize. It was guttural and rhythmic, rising and falling like the beat of some ancient drum. As he chanted, he cast handfuls of herbs onto the fire, filling the air with pungent smoke. Despite my fear, I found myself growing drowsy, lulled by the chanting and the smoke. My eyelids grew heavy and my head nodded. Some distant part of me knew I should be terrified, but a strange lassitude had settled over me, a sense of dreamy unreality. Through the haze, I heard Blackfeather's voice sounding strangely distant. "The Skinwalkers draw their power from fear and pain," he said. "To defeat them, we must confront them in the place where they are strongest, the spirit world." His words made a kind of sleep-fogged sense. This was a battle that couldn't be fought with guns and fists, but with will and belief. We had to beat them on their own ground. I felt myself slipping, falling into a place that was not quite sleep, not quite waking. The hogan faded away, replaced by a landscape of swirling mist and shifting shadows. I could feel Blackfeather's presence beside me, the solid strength of him, but when I turned to look, his form was indistinct, wavering like smoke. Before us, the mists parted, revealing a scene out of nightmare. It was the forest, but not the forest as I had known it. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like grasping claws. The ground was carpeted in bones, picked clean and white as ash, and there, crouched in the center of the clearing, were the Skinwalkers. They were even more horrifying here, in this place where thought and reality blurred together. They were like living shadows, their forms constantly shifting and changing. One moment they were wolves, lean and hungry-eyed. The next they were great lumbering bears, lips curled back from yellowed fangs. They saw us at the same instant we saw them, and their eyes lit with a feral, eager light. "Foolish old man," one of them rasped, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "You think to challenge us here, in the place of our power?" Blackfeather stepped forward, putting himself between me and the monsters. In this strange dreamscape he seemed taller, more solid, his form outlined in faint silver light. "Your power is false," he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "Stolen through violation and desecration, the true guardians of this land reject you." The Skinwalkers laughed, a sound like bones rattling in a crypt. They began to circle us, their forms shifting faster now, blurring into a dizzying kaleidoscope of fangs and claws and malevolent glowing eyes. "We will feast on your bones, old fool," they hissed. "And as for this one," their eyes flicked to me, filled with hunger, "his terror will be sweet." They lunged forward as one, a wave of shadow and savagery. But Blackfeather stood firm, raising his hands in a gesture of warding. A blast of light erupted from his palms, so bright it seared my eyes. The Skinwalkers fell back, shrieking in pain and fury. Blackfeather seized my arm, his grip like iron. "Remember who you are," he commanded. "Remember your humanity. It is a light they cannot abide." I nodded, trying to center myself, to find that core of unyielding selfhood, of warm and living flesh. It was hard, harder than anything I had ever done. The Skinwalker's presence lashed at my mind, trying to fill it with animal panic, with the frenzied urge to flee. But I held on, gritting my mental teeth, and slowly, I felt something kindling in my chest. A spark, small at first but growing steadier. The light of the soul, inviolate and eternal. The Skinwalkers felt it too. They drew back, hissing and spitting like scalded cats. "No," they wailed. "You have no power here." "You're wrong," I said, and my voice was steady. "I have the only power that matters." And with that, I let the light inside me blaze forth, pouring all my belief and defiance into it. It struck the Skinwalkers like a physical blow, hurling them back into the shadows. They screamed as it touched them, their dark forms unraveling like cheap cloth. "No," they howled. "We are eternal. We are the hunger that waits in the dark places of the world." But their cries grew fainter and more distant as the light burned through them, reducing them to tatters and wisps. The forest around us began to fade, the trees going translucent, the ground misting away beneath our feet. I felt Blackfeather's hand on my shoulder, solid and real. "It's time to go back," he said gently. I nodded, sudden exhaustion sweeping over me. I let my eyes drift closed and felt the dream forest slip away. I awoke on the floor of the hogan, blinking in the firelight. For a moment I wasn't sure where I was, or if the confrontation with the Skinwalkers had been real. But then I saw Blackfeather kneeling beside me, his face lined with weariness, but filled with quiet triumph. "Is it over?" I croaked, my throat dry as old parchment. He nodded. "For now, you did well, boy, better than well. You remembered your true self, and that is a powerful magic." Slowly, painfully, I sat up. My whole body ached, but it was a clean pain, the pain of muscles that have been pushed to their limit and held. I looked around at the inside of the hogan, at the rough walls and dancing shadows, and I had never been so grateful to see anything in my life. David and Joseph were standing by the door, looking out into the night. They turned as I rose, and I saw the same exhausted triumph in their faces that I had seen in their uncle's. "Scar?" I asked, sudden fear clutching at me as I remembered his fall. David grinned, the expression transforming his stern features. "Just a little banged up. Takes more than one mangy flea bag to put our little brother down for good." Relief flooded through me, so intense it made my knees weak. It was over. We had won. Against all odds, against an enemy that had haunted the dark corners of the world for centuries, we had emerged victorious. But as I looked around at the drawn faces of my companions, I knew our victory had come at a cost. This was just one battle in a war that had been raging since the first human told stories around a flickering fire. The Skinwalkers were a manifestation of something deep and dark in the human psyche, and as long as there was fear and pain in the world, they would never be truly gone. Still, for this moment, in this place, we had triumphed. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked first. That was worth something. That was worth everything. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of sage and wood smoke. "Thank you," I said to Blackfeather, to all of them. "I would be dead if not for you." Blackfeather shook his head. "You found the strength in yourself, boy. We just helped you remember it was there." He clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip strong and sure. "Now let's get you out of here. I think you've had enough of these woods for one lifetime." I couldn't argue with that. As we stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, the first pale fingers of light reaching over the eastern hills, I breathed deeply of the clean, piney air. The forest looked different now, the shadows less threatening, the silences less ominous. Or maybe it was I who had changed. We walked out of those woods together, 4 men who had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. And though I knew the memory of that night would stay with me forever, though I knew my nightmares would be haunted by glowing eyes and shifting shadows, I also knew I had found something invaluable. I had found the unbreakable core of light within myself, the part that could not be touched by any external darkness, and that I knew would guide me through whatever shadows lay ahead. The light had won, at least for now, and in the end that was all any of us could ask for. It's been 5 years since that night in the Coconino National Forest. 5 years since I stared into the heart of darkness and somehow miraculously emerged on the other side. Not unscathed, no. Those wounds, mental and physical, healed slowly. Some of them left scars. But I did heal, with time, with patience, with the support of people who cared about me even when I found it hard to care about myself. People like John Blackfeather, who became a mentor and a friend. He taught me about the old ways of his people, about respecting the natural world and the spirits that inhabit it. Under his guidance, I learned to make peace with what had happened to me, to see it not as a curse, but as a hard and valuable lesson. I never went back to my teaching job. That life, the life of fluorescent lights and chalkboard dust, felt like it belonged to someone else, someone I barely remembered being. Instead, I moved out to the reservation, built a small cabin at the edge of the wilderness. I spent my days hiking, exploring, learning the land. And at night I wrote. I wrote about my experiences, about the terror and the wonder of that night, about the ancient evil that stalks the shadows of our world and the light that holds it at bay. I wrote stories to warn and to inspire, to remind people that there is more to this existence than what we can see with our physical eyes. Some of those stories found an audience. I developed a small but devoted following, people drawn to the raw honesty of my words, to the hard truths I had learned in blood and terror. I cherished those readers, knowing that in some small way I was helping them face their own darknesses. But more than that, I wrote for myself, to remember, to process, to heal. The words were a balm, a way of transmuting pain into something meaningful. Through them, I slowly rebuilt myself, piecing together a new identity from the shattered fragments of the old. Orson was a part of that process. After I'd recovered enough to face the world again, he was my first visitor out in my wilderness refuge. I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw me, the mix of joy and sorrow and fierce, fierce pride. "You made it," he said, pulling me into a bone-crushing hug. "You magnificent bastard, you actually made it." We talked long into the night, trading stories of darkness and survival. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had brushed up against the uncanny corners of the world. Orson had his own tales to tell, his own scars to show, but like me, he had come through the fire tempered and strong. We stayed friends, brothers in a way that went beyond blood. He came out to visit when he could, bringing news of the outside world, keeping me grounded. And on the nights when the memories pressed close and the wind howled like a lost and hungry thing, I knew I could call him, that he would understand. Life went on, as it tends to do. The raw edges of trauma smoothed over, never disappearing entirely but becoming less jagged, less likely to catch me unawares and tear me open anew. I found a measure of peace in my solitude, a quiet joy in the simplicity of living in harmony with the land. But I never forgot. How could I? The events of that night were seared into my soul, a permanent part of who I was. In a strange way, I was grateful for them. They had shown me the depths of my own strength, the unbreakable core of light that dwells in all of us, waiting to be called upon in our darkest hour. And because I remembered, because I had faced that darkness and triumphed, I knew I could face anything that life might throw at me. I had been tested in the crucible of terror and emerged transformed. I often thought of the Skinwalkers out there in the vastness of the world, lurking in the spaces between the rationale and the known, waiting for their chance to prey on the fear and pain of the unwary. The thought no longer filled me with the bone-deep terror it once had. Instead, I felt a grim sort of determination. They were still out there, yes. They would always be out there in one form or another. As long as there was darkness in human hearts, they would find a way to manifest. But so too would there always be those who stood against them. Those who had faced the abyss and chosen to carry the light. People like John Blackfeather and his nephews, keeping the ancient wisdom alive, guarding the borderlands between the worlds. People like Orson, bearing witness to the strange and the uncanny, reminding us that we are not alone in our encounters with the unknown. And people like me, scarred and tested and stronger for it, ready to share our hard-won knowledge with any who would listen. We are the light bringers, the storytellers, the ones who have walked through the valley of the shadow and emerged changed but unbroken. We are the guardians of the flame, the keepers of the watch. And as long as we remember, As long as we hold fast to our light, the darkness will never triumph. I know this now, with a certainty that goes soul deep. I have seen the worst the world has to offer, looked into the hungry eyes of the beast and the bottomless depths of evil, and I have not faltered. I am Ethan Calloway. I am a survivor, a storyteller, a keeper of the light. The boy who went into the woods that fateful night is gone, transformed by fire and fear into something stronger, wiser, kinder. I carry his memory with me always, the shadow and the clarity of it, the lesson and the promise. I hold him close as I sit on my porch in the cool desert night, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient dance, listening to the coyotes singing to the moon. He is a part of me, that frightened, desperate boy. He always will be. But he is not all of me. I am more than the sum of my scars. I am the light that endures, the story that gets told and retold around the crackling campfire. I am every word of hope and heart's truth that I send out into the world. I am Ethan Calloway. I walk the borderlands between light and shadow, and I do not walk alone. There's something about the wild places that's always called to me. Growing up in the high desert of Arizona, the pine forests and red rock canyons felt like old friends, comforting in their rugged permanence. As a kid, I'd spend long summer days exploring every arroyo and mesa, much to my mother's exasperation. Those solo wanderings taught me to rely on my own wits, to find peace in solitude. Even now, years later and 2,000 miles from my childhood haunts, I find myself drawn to the untamed wilderness whenever life in the city starts to chafe. There's a certain stillness to be found under the pines, a sense of perspective that makes the daily worries fade into insignificance. For me, the trail has always been the path to clarity and healing. But that was before that fateful hike 2 years ago. Before I learned that the wild places hold more than peace and beauty. Before I discovered what else roams those ancient forests, things that defy explanation and shatter sanity. My name is Asher Kincaid, and I've spent most of my life seeking solace in nature. For the past 5 years, I've worked as a software engineer in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's a good life. Interesting work, close friends, and the majestic San Francisco peaks always on the horizon, calling me to explore. Hiking is more than a hobby for me. It's a lifeline, an escape valve from the pressures of deadlines and debugs. I've tackled trails all over the Southwest, from the slot canyons of Utah to the sky islands of southern Arizona. But my favorite haunts have always been the ponderosa pine forests around Flagstaff. It was on one of those local trails that I first met Orson Whittle. He was a transplant like me, an artist who'd fallen in love with the Southwest light. We bonded over a shared appreciation for kitschy roadside attractions and good green chili. Before long, we were regular hiking partners, pushing each other to attempt ever more challenging trails. Orson was the one who first brought up Skeleton Ridge. He'd heard about it from some old-timers at the art co-op, a remote trail deep in the Coconino National Forest. Supposedly it was an old Apache site, a place of power and mystery. The more he talked about it, the more intrigued I became. We spent weeks planning the trip, poring over topo maps and researching the area's history. Looking back, I can see all the warning signs I missed, the little details that should have tipped me off that something wasn't right about that place. The way the old-timers clammed up when we pressed for more information. The palpable unease of the ranger when we filed our backcountry permit. The fact that there was almost no information to be found about the trail online, despite the area's popularity with hikers. But I was too caught up in the romance of it all, too thrilled by the idea of discovering a place that was off the beaten path. If only I'd known then what I know now, the price I'd pay for that naivete. If only I'd listened to that small, cautious voice in the back of my mind, the one that whispered that some places are left alone for good reason. But I didn't listen, and in my foolish enthusiasm I convinced my best friend to disregard the warnings as well. Together we set off down a path from which there could be no return, a path that would lead us into the hunting grounds of something ancient and hungry and cruel. The hike began, as most disasters do, in a spirit of carefree excitement. But it would end in blood and terror and a shattering of everything I thought I knew about the natural world. This is the story of what happened to us on Skeleton Ridge. and of the scars I will bear, both inside and out, for the rest of my life. In the weeks leading up to our trip, Orson and I threw ourselves into planning with an intensity that bordered on obsession. We spent long evenings at his studio apartment, hunched over topographic maps and debating the merits of various gear choices. Orson, ever the artist, sketched out imagined vistas and ancient petroglyphs, his excitement infectious. "Can you imagine it, Ash?" he said, his eyes sparkling. "A place that's managed to stay hidden all these years, untouched by the modern world. Who knows what we might find out there?" I nodded, caught up in the sense of adventure. It's like stepping into a portal to the past, a chance to see the landscape as it was 100, even 1,000 years ago. We pored over historical accounts and archaeological surveys, trying to piece together the trail's history. There were tantalizing hints of ancient sites and sacred places, but the specifics remained frustratingly vague. It was as if the place resisted being known, its secrets jealously guarded. As the date of our hike approached, we assembled our gear with meticulous care. We invested in top-of-the-line backpacks, ultralight tents, and satellite GPS devices. Orson, always one for authenticity, insisted on learning how to flint-knap arrowheads and build a bow drill fire. I contented myself with packing an extra Bic lighter. Despite our preparation, there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite shake. It started with small things, a flock of crows that seemed to follow us on our training hikes, an unseasonal chill in the air that lingered even in the midday sun. I told myself it was just nerves, the natural apprehension before a challenging trek. But then there were the dreams. In the weeks before we left, my sleep was plagued by strange, fragmented visions. I wandered through a forest where the trees had faces that watched me with ancient, knowing eyes. I heard whispers in a language I couldn't understand, guttural and harsh. And always just at the edge of my sight, there was a shadow that moved with a sinuous, predatory grace, never quite revealing itself. I tried to dismiss the dreams as a product of an overactive imagination, but they left me feeling unsettled and on edge. I considered mentioning them to Orson, but something held me back. I didn't want to seem like I was getting cold feet, not when he was so excited about the trip. And if I'm honest, there was a part of me that was drawn to the mystery, the hint of something ancient and unknowable lurking in those woods. I've always been fascinated by the liminal spaces, the places where the veil between worlds seems thin. Maybe that's what pulled me toward Skeleton Ridge, despite the warnings and the unease. The night before we left, I barely slept. I checked and rechecked my gear, running through mental checklists until the words lost all meaning. As I finally drifted off in the gray pre-dawn light, I had one final dream. In it, I stood at the edge of a vast chasm, staring down into a darkness that seemed to have no bottom. From that abyss, something called to me, its voice a sibilant whisper that wormed its way into my bones. I woke with a start, my heart pounding and my skin clammy with sweat. Outside, the first rays of sun were just starting to paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Orson would be picking me up in less than an hour. There was no more time for doubts or second thoughts. With a deep breath, I shouldered my pack and stepped out into the cool morning air. The die was cast, the path chosen. For better or worse, we were heading into the wild, into a place that had been waiting for us long before we even knew of its existence. If only I had known then just how high the price of that knowledge would be. If only I had seen the signs for what they truly were, not a call to adventure, but a warning of horrors to come. But in that moment, all I felt was the thrill of anticipation, the heady rush of stepping into the unknown. With a final glance at the sleeping city behind me, I turned to face the wilderness ahead, ready to meet whatever challenges it might bring. I had no idea that I was walking into a nightmare from which there would be no waking, a darkness that would follow me long after I left those woods behind. But then, I suppose that's the nature of true horror. You never see it coming until it's far, far too late. The drive to the trailhead was a blur of winding mountain roads and increasingly dense forest. Orson chattered excitedly in the passenger seat, speculating about what we might discover. I tried to match his enthusiasm, but I couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had settled over me like a shroud. As we pulled into the deserted parking lot at the base of the trail, I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warm summer morning. The forest loomed before us, the pines standing silent sentinel. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense of waiting that set my nerves on edge. "You feel that?" Orson asked, his voice hushed. "It's like the whole place is holding its breath." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The dream from the night before flashed through my mind, the whisper from the abyss echoing in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself in the present moment. We shouldered our packs and set off down the narrow trail, the gravel crunching under our boots. The path wound through a stand of towering ponderosa pines, their bark a patchwork of browns and grays. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. At first, the hike was everything we'd hoped for. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of pine needles and sun-warmed earth. Birds called from the branches above, their songs overlapping in a melodic chorus. Orson and I fell into an easy rhythm, our conversation punctuated by comfortable silences. But as we pushed deeper into the forest, subtle signs of wrongness began to accumulate. The birdsong faded, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional gust of wind through the treetops. The shadows seemed to lengthen and deepen, taking on a life of their own. And then there were the trees themselves. As we climbed higher into the hills, the pines gave way to gnarled junipers and twisted oaks, their branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. Many bore strange scars, their bark carved with symbols and patterns that seemed to writhe and shimmer in the corner of my eye. "What do you make of these?" Orson asked, tracing a particularly intricate marking. "They almost look like petroglyphs, but I've never seen anything quite like them." I shook my head, a prickle of unease running up my spine. "I don't know. They don't match any of the styles I've seen in the archaeology books, and there's something off about them, like they were made by something not quite human." Orson laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness to the sound. "Come on, Ash, you're starting to sound like one of those conspiracy nuts on the History Channel. I'm sure there's a perfectly rational explanation." I wanted to believe him. Rational explanations had always been my refuge, a bulwark against the dark things that lurked at the edges of imagination. But out here in the heart of the wild, those bulwarks felt flimsy, as insubstantial as paper walls against a rising flood. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I froze. There, in the soft earth at the edge of the path, was a footprint. But it was unlike any animal track I had ever seen. It was huge, nearly 3 feet long, with 3 toes tipped with wicked-looking claws. The edges were oddly blurred, as if the thing that left it was not quite solid. Orson saw it a second after I did, his face paled, his eyes widening. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. "But I don't think it was made by anything we want to meet." We stared at the print for a long moment, the silence of the forest pressing in around us. Then, by some unspoken agreement, we shouldered our packs and hurried on, not daring to look back. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone in those woods. Something was watching us, tracking our every move with an inhuman patience and hunger. And deep in my gut, I knew it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself. The shadows lengthened as we pushed onward, the sun dipping lower in the sky. We should have been nearing our planned campsite, but the trail seemed to twist and turn in on itself, leading us deeper into the wilderness. The markings on the trees grew more frequent, more frenzied, until it seemed that every trunk bore some strange sign or sigil. Just as the light began to fade from the sky, we stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a ring of blackened stones, the remains of an ancient fire pit. Animal bones littered the ground, picked clean and white as old teeth. And there, at the far edge of the clearing, something moved in the gathering dusk. Something tall and lean and hungry, its form rippling and changing like smoke on the wind. Something that wore the shapes of the things it had devoured, mocking them with its very existence. Orson saw it too. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face was a mask of terror, his eyes wide and white in the failing light. I don't remember picking up the rock. I don't remember hurling it at the thing, watching it connect with a sickening crack. All I remember is grabbing Orson's arm, my fingers digging into his flesh hard enough to bruise, and screaming a single word over and over again. Run! And then we were crashing through the undergrowth, thorns tearing at our skin and clothes, blind panic propelling us forward. Behind us, the thing let out a howl that seemed to shake the very earth, a sound of rage and hunger and twisted, ancient glee. The nightmare had begun, and there could be no waking from it. There was only the mad rush through the darkening woods, the certainty of death snapping at our heels, and the terrible knowledge that we had walked willingly into the monster's lair. In that moment, as the last light faded and the hungry shadows closed in, I knew we would be lucky to see the dawn, and even if we did, I knew we would never be the same, never be free of the taint of the thing that hunted us. For we had looked into the face of something that should not be, and it had looked back with eyes that knew no mercy, no pity, only an endless, yawning hunger. And it would not stop until it had devoured us, body and soul. The forest closed in around us as we ran, branches whipping at our faces and roots seeming to grasp at our ankles. My lungs burned and my muscles screamed, but I didn't dare slow down. Not with the sound of that thing crashing through the undergrowth behind us, its howl splitting the night air. Beside me, Orson stumbled, nearly going down. I grabbed his arm, hauling him upright without breaking stride. His face was pale in the dimming light, his eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" he gasped out between ragged breaths. "What the hell is chasing us?" I just shook my head, unable to put words to the awful certainty that had taken root in my gut. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. It was an obscene blot on the face of creation, a being that defied rational explanation. We burst out of the tree line into a small gully, a dry stream bed that cut through the earth like an open wound. I paused for a moment, casting desperate glances left and right. Which way would offer the best chance at escape? Which path would lead us out of this nightmare? Behind us, a branch snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Orson and I whirled as one to see a shape emerge from the shadows. It was tall, taller than any human, and spindly, its limbs seeming to bend and flow in ways that defied anatomy. Its head was a shapeless mass, a constantly shifting blur that hurt to look at directly. And its eyes, God help me, its eyes. They burned in that mass like holes torn in reality itself, twin abysses that pulled at my sanity with a force that was almost physical. In that gaze I saw all the hunger of the void, all the cold and endless appetite of oblivion. I don't know which of us screamed, probably both. The thing took a step forward, its feet making no sound on the rocky ground, and we turned and ran, plunging into the gully like madmen. The dry stream bed turned and twisted, the walls rising up on either side until it felt like we were running at the bottom of a great rocky scar. The creature's howls echoed off the narrow confines, coming from everywhere and nowhere, always closer, ever closer. My foot caught on a loose stone and I went sprawling, gravel cutting into my palms and knees. For a moment I could only lay there, my breath coming in great ragged gasps, certain that I would feel the creature's claws sinking into my flesh at any second. But it was Orson who grabbed me, his hands shaking as he pulled me to my feet. "Come on," he urged, his voice raw with fear. "We have to keep moving. We have to find a way out of here." I nodded, beyond words, and we staggered on, supporting each other as much as our own failing strength. The walls of the gully seemed to press in on us, the night growing deeper and thicker with each passing second. It was only as we rounded another bend that I saw it, a dark crease in the stone, a shadow that seemed more solid than it should be, a cave nearly hidden in the gloom. "There," I croaked, pointing with a trembling hand. "We can hide, try to wait it out until morning." Even as I said the words, I knew how pitiful they were. What good would daylight do against a thing born of nightmare? What hope could we have against a being that seemed woven from the very fabric of darkness itself? But it was all we had, and so we stumbled toward that black portal, clinging to each other like frightened children. Behind us, the creature's howls rose in a mocking crescendo, its hunger a palpable force. We plunged into the cave, the darkness enfolding us like a physical thing. The air was cold and damp, the stones slick beneath our feet. We kept moving by feel, by instinct, afraid to stop even for a moment. It was only when the last faint light from the entrance had faded that I saw them, two pinpricks of pale fire in the blackness, like distant stars seen through the bottom of a well. Eyes, inhuman eyes that held no warmth, no pity, only a vast and yawning hunger. The last thing I remember is Orson's scream, high and terrible and all too quickly cut off. And then the eyes were rushing toward me, growing larger and larger, until they filled my entire world, until I was falling into them, drowning in their cold and endless depths. After that, there is only darkness and the distant thunder of my own heartbeat, darkness and the certainty that I was no longer alone in my own mind, that something else had followed me back from that cave, some hidden rider that clung to the cracks in my psyche like a cancer, that the real nightmare was only just beginning. It's been 2 years now since that night, 2 years of waking screams and shattered mirrors, of memories that feel more real than reality. The doctors call it post-traumatic stress, a psychotic break brought on by some imagined horror. But I know the truth. I know that what hunts me isn't imaginary, that it's patient and cunning and oh so very real. I see it in every shadow, hear its whispers in the silence between my own thoughts. It's waiting for me to slip, to let down my guard for just one fatal instant, and when I do, it will devour me, as slowly and intimately as a lover. This is my warning and my confession. Don't go into those woods. Don't seek out the dark places, the wild places where the edges of the map turn to blank parchment, because in those places there are things that watch and wait and hunger, things that wear the skins of your deepest fears, that know your name and the secret rhythms of your heart. And if they catch you, they will never let you go. You will be lost forever, as I am lost, a ghost trapped in the labyrinth of my own shattered mind, with only the memory of that final, terrible understanding for company in the endless dark. Pray you never learn what I now know. Pray you never see what waits in the spaces between the stars, in the shadow of every turned corner. Pray you never meet the skeleton man. The deep has a way of calling to those who've touched it. It whispers in your dreams, tugs at your thoughts during quiet moments, until the surface world feels like the alien place. I should know. I've spent more time beneath the waves than most people spend in their cars. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been cave diving for 15 years. That's what I tell people when they ask what I do. The truth is more complex. I'm a marine archaeologist specializing in submerged cave systems, with a focus on prehistoric human habitation. At least that's what my university credentials say. What I really am is an addict, hooked on the thrill of being the first person to illuminate chambers that have been dark for millennia. The incident at Cenote Verde changed everything. 3 years ago, my diving partner Sarah Martinez and I were mapping a newly discovered branch of the cave system. We'd done everything by the book: redundant air supplies, guidelines, emergency protocols. Sarah was one of the best in the field with over 2,000 logged dives. What happened shouldn't have been possible. We were about 90 minutes into the dive, at around 140 feet, when we found the arch. It was massive, easily 30 feet high, and completely smooth as if carved by tools rather than natural processes. That alone would have made it the find of the decade. But it was the markings that stopped us cold. Geometric patterns, spirals, and what looked like written script, all etched into the rock with impossible precision. Sarah was filming while I took measurements when our primary lights began to flicker. Not dim or fade, flicker, in a rhythmic pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The water around us grew noticeably colder, and our computers started showing impossible depth readings, fluctuating between 140 and 400 feet, despite us remaining stationary. Then we heard it. Even now I struggle to describe that sound. It was like whale song, but distorted, with harmonics that shouldn't exist underwater. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah signaled that she was switching to her backup light. I watched her reach for it, her movements precise and professional despite the situation. That's when the darkness swallowed her. One moment she was there, the next, nothing. No bubbles, no sound, no disturbance in the water. Just empty space where my friend and colleague had been seconds before. The search lasted 2 weeks. We found her tanks, her camera, even her weight belt, all neatly placed on a ledge 200 feet from where she vanished, but we never found Sarah. The official report cited equipment failure and disorientation as probable causes. They suggested she must have panicked, ditched her gear, and gotten lost in the cave system. But they never explained how her equipment ended up arranged so precisely, or why the camera's memory card was completely erased despite being in perfect working order. I spent the next 3 years obsessing over every detail of that dive. I analyzed the footage from my camera countless times, though it showed nothing after the lights began to flicker. I researched similar incidents, cross-referenced geological surveys, even studied ancient Mayan texts about cenotes being gateways to Xibalba, their underworld. And now, after all this time, I'm going back. The university cut my funding last month, calling my research increasingly erratic and unfocused. They're not wrong. I've burned through relationships, alienated colleagues, and spent every penny I had chasing answers. But 2 weeks ago, I received an email from Dr. Isabel Reyes, a marine biologist in Mexico. She's been monitoring unusual acoustic signatures in Cenote Verde, sounds that match the frequency pattern I recorded just before Sarah disappeared. I've arranged to borrow equipment from the university's storage facility. My access card still works, and the night security guard owes me a favor. Tomorrow night I'll load up my truck with everything I need: rebreather system, multiple backup lights, high-definition underwater cameras with extended battery packs, and the new sonar mapping device I've modified to record subsonic frequencies. The rational part of my brain knows this is madness. Solo cave diving is suicidal under the best circumstances. But I have to know what's down there, what took Sarah, what's been calling to me in my dreams, showing me glimpses of impossible architecture beneath the waves, whispering promises of answers if I just go deep enough. As I pack my gear, checking and rechecking every piece of equipment, I can already feel the pull. The deep is calling, and this time I'm ready to answer. The Cenote Verde research station was exactly as I remembered it, a cluster of prefab buildings perched on the limestone rim of what looked like an ordinary pond to untrained eyes. But beneath that placid surface lay one of the most extensive underwater cave systems in the world. Dr. Reyes met me at the gate, her face a mix of concern and barely contained excitement. She was younger than I expected, probably in her early 30s, with quick, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every piece of equipment as I unloaded. "I have to show you something before you go down," she said, leading me to her lab. The small room was dominated by computer monitors displaying various waveform patterns. These readings started 3 weeks ago. At first we thought it was some kind of seismic activity. She pulled up a sound file and played it through the speakers. My heart nearly stopped. That same haunting melody that had plagued my dreams for 3 years filled the room. But this time there was something else beneath it, a pattern that reminded me of Morse code, but more complex. "It's getting stronger," Isabel continued, pointing to a graph. "And look at this, it's not random. There's a clear mathematical progression. Whatever's making these sounds, it's intelligent." As I helped Isabel calibrate my equipment for the dive, small things started going wrong. Equipment that had worked perfectly during testing began malfunctioning. My primary depth gauge would randomly jump to impossible readings. The backup camera's battery, fully charged that morning, showed as completely drained. More unsettling were the small sounds coming from the cenote, subtle splashes and ripples despite the complete absence of wind. Once, we both clearly heard what sounded like laughter echoing up from the water, though the site was deserted except for us. "You don't have to do this," Isabel said as I began my final equipment check. "We can wait for a team from the university." I shook my head. 3 years ago, I watched my best friend vanish in these caves. If there's even a chance of finding out what happened to her, I have to try. The sun was setting as I finished gearing up, painting the water in shades of blood and gold. I ran through my pre-dive checklist one final time: primary and backup rebreathers, multiple lights, guidelines, emergency beacons, the modified sonar device, and cameras recording everything. "I'll monitor you from here," Isabel said, adjusting her headset. "Remember, if you lose contact for more than 3 minutes, I'm calling in emergency services. No heroics." I nodded, but we both knew that help would come too late if anything went wrong at depth. Cave diving is unforgiving. The smallest mistake can be fatal, and panic is a luxury you can't afford. As I approached the water's edge, the surface seemed to ripple unnaturally, as if something just beneath was disturbing it. The late evening light caught the movement, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing before dissolving back into random waves. My equipment felt unusually heavy as I did my final checks. The regulator had a metallic taste I'd never noticed before, and the air from my tanks seemed somehow thicker than normal, but everything tested within normal parameters. "Testing communications," I said into my throat mic. "Receiving you clearly." Isabel's voice came through my earpiece. "Surface conditions are stable. You're clear to begin descent." I took one last look at the darkening sky, then slipped beneath the surface. The familiar embrace of the water should have been comforting, but something felt off. The visibility was much lower than normal for Cenote Verde, and the beam from my primary light seemed to be absorbed by the water rather than penetrating it. As I began my descent into the cave system, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. More than once I caught movement at the edge of my light's beam, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. At 30 feet, I reached the cave's entrance. The massive limestone arch loomed before me, its surface covered in the same geometric patterns I remembered from 3 years ago. But something was different. The markings seemed to shift when viewed directly, as if rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. "Starting cave penetration," I reported. "Visibility approximately 15 feet. Setting guideline now." Isabel's response came back distorted, her words breaking up. "Be careful. Readings strange." I secured my guideline and paused, floating in the entrance to the cave. Everything in my training and experience was screaming at me to abort the dive, but somewhere in the darkness ahead were answers I'd spent 3 years seeking. Taking a deep breath of recycled air, I switched on my recording devices and began my descent into the abyss. The first 100 feet of descent felt almost normal, the familiar dance of buoyancy control, checking gauges, and maintaining awareness of my guideline. But as I passed the 100-foot mark, things began to change. The limestone walls, typically smooth from millennia of water flow, started showing impossible textures. In my light beam, I could see what looked like bas-reliefs emerging from the rock, figures that seemed to writhe and move in my peripheral vision, only to become ordinary mineral deposits when viewed directly. "Passing 120 feet, I reported. "Do you copy?" Isabel's voice came back as broken static, with only occasional words clear enough to understand. "Interference. Readings off. Careful." At 130 feet, I reached the junction where Sarah and I had made our discovery 3 years ago. The archway was still there, its perfect geometric form defying natural explanation. But the markings we'd found had changed. The symbols were different, more complex, and they seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescence that my cameras somehow failed to capture. That's when I noticed the temperature drop. My suit's thermal sensors showed a sudden plunge from 75 degrees Fahrenheit to near freezing, though I felt no cold. The water around me became noticeably denser, moving with an almost syrupy consistency. "Isabel, are you getting these readings?" Nothing but static answered me. As I examined the arch, my light caught something that made my heart skip. A fresh guideline, the bright yellow rope standing out against the dark rock. But that was impossible. No one had dived this section since Sarah's disappearance. I'd made sure of that. I followed the line, knowing I should turn back but unable to resist. It led deeper into the cave system, through passages that hadn't existed during my previous dives. The rock walls here were different, darker, with veins of some metallic substance that reflected my light in impossible ways. At 150 feet I heard it, the same haunting melody that had haunted my dreams, but clearer now, more distinct. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the water and through my body. My depth gauge began to fluctuate wildly, showing readings from 150 to 1,000 feet despite my stable position. Then I saw the bones. They emerged from the cave wall as if they were part of the rock itself. Human bones, perfectly preserved and arranged in elaborate patterns. But these weren't ancient remains. The diving equipment scattered among them was modern, some of it models I recognized from the past few years. As I approached for a closer look, my primary light flickered and died. I quickly switched to my backup, trying to control my breathing as panic threatened to set in. The backup light seemed dimmer than it should be, barely penetrating the increasingly murky water. That's when I saw her. A figure hung motionless in the water about 20 feet ahead, back turned to me. The diving gear was identical to Sarah's, right down to the custom wetsuit design she'd been so proud of. As I watched, frozen in place, the figure slowly began to turn. "Sarah?" I whispered, knowing it was impossible. The figure completed its turn, and I felt my sanity begin to crack. Where a face should have been was only smooth, blank flesh, with a single pulsing light where the left eye should be. The thing that wasn't Sarah began to move toward me, its movements all wrong, too fluid for something underwater. My backup light chose that moment to fail, plunging me into total darkness. In that moment of blindness, I felt something brush against my leg, something with too many fingers that moved like cold worms against my wetsuit. The melody grew louder, and with it came words, not heard with my ears but felt in my bones. "Welcome back, Marcus. We've been waiting for you." In that moment of pure darkness, training took over. I forced my breathing to slow, fighting the urge to bolt. One hand gripped my guideline while the other found my emergency light stick, cracking it to life. The pale green chemical glow seemed pitifully weak, but it was enough to show me I was alone. The figure was gone if it had ever been there. But the bone-deep melody remained, now accompanied by a pulsing light emanating from deeper in the cave. My instruments were useless, depth gauge spinning wildly, compass rotating in continuous circles, air monitor showing impossible readings. Following basic cave diving protocol would mean retreating. But as I turned to follow my guideline back, I saw that the passage behind me had changed. Where there had been a tunnel was now a solid wall, covered in those shifting, glowing symbols. Only one way remained, forward, toward the pulsing light. The passage widened into a massive chamber that shouldn't exist at this depth. My light stick revealed walls that rose at least 100 feet, forming a perfect dome. The floor was covered in what looked like technology, but nothing I recognized. Curved metal structures merged seamlessly with the rock, patterns of light flowing through them like blood through veins. In the center stood a pillar of black stone, covered in the same symbols I'd seen throughout the cave system. But these were different. They moved freely across the surface, rearranging themselves as I watched. At its base lay piles of diving equipment from different eras, some so old it must have been from the earliest days of cave diving. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, speaking perfect English despite the impossibility of sound traveling this way underwater. I spun around, nearly losing my regulator. Sarah floated there, the real Sarah this time, not the faceless thing from before. She looked exactly as she had 3 years ago, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's not really me," she said, answering my unspoken question. "But this form is easier for you to process. We've learned that humans respond better to familiar shapes." The thing wearing Sarah's face drifted closer. Every movement was perfect, exactly how she used to move underwater. But there was something else beneath the familiar facade, something vast and ancient that leaked through around the edges. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "We are the architects," Not Sarah replied. "We have been here since before your kind crawled from the oceans. This chamber is one of our libraries." As if responding to her words, the patterns of light in the chamber intensified. Images began forming in the water around us, creatures I had no words to describe, cities that defied physics, technology that seemed to blur the line between organic and mechanical. "Why, Sarah? Why take her?" "Take her?" The thing wearing my friend's face tilted its head in an eerily familiar gesture. She chose to stay, just as others before her chose, just as you will choose. The melody that had been haunting me grew stronger, and with it came understanding. The symbols on the walls weren't just writing, they were equations, formulas that described the fundamental nature of reality. And they were wrong, or rather, our understanding of physics was wrong. "Show me," I heard myself say. "Show me what she chose." Not Sarah's smile widened impossibly, her face stretching in ways human muscles couldn't allow. The water around us began to vibrate with that haunting melody, and suddenly I was seeing through more than just my eyes. The chamber exploded into multi-dimensional space. What I'd taken for technology was actually living mathematics, equations made flesh and metal. The beings that created this place existed in geometries human minds weren't meant to comprehend. And Sarah, I saw her now, truly saw her. She wasn't dead. She had become something else. Her consciousness expanded into the vast library of impossible knowledge. She was everywhere in these caves, part of the living architecture itself. Your kind thinks of evolution as a purely biological process, not, Sarah explained, her voice resonating directly in my mind. But consciousness can evolve too. We offer that evolution. My air gauge showed 30 minutes remaining. Not that it mattered. The numbers were probably lying anyway. Why now? Why are you showing us this after all this time? The ocean levels are rising. Soon much of your world will be underwater. We've been waiting, watching your species advance. Some of you are finally ready to understand. The chamber's lights began pulsing faster, and I felt pressure building in my skull. Images flooded my mind. Future cities beneath the waves. Humanity adapted to underwater life through means both technological and biological. And something else. Vast shadows moving in the deep trenches of the world's oceans. There are others, I realized. Other sites like this. Many others. We have been patient, but now time grows short. The thing that wasn't Sarah gestured toward the black pillar. The symbols rearranged themselves, forming patterns that hurt to look at, but somehow made perfect sense. I saw equations that would revolutionize physics, biology, our entire understanding of reality. Why me? You never stopped looking, never stopped questioning. Even when they called you obsessed, unstable, you knew there was more to Sarah's disappearance than a simple diving accident. The choice before me seemed impossible. Everything I'd sought for 3 years was here. Answers, understanding Sarah. But the price of that knowledge was becoming clearer with each passing moment. My consciousness was already changing, expanding in ways that threatened to tear my sanity apart. I could feel the vast intelligence of this place pressing against my mind, offering glimpses of realities that human brains weren't meant to process. Time to choose, Marcus, not Sarah said, her form flickering between human appearance and something far more complex. The changes have already begun. Stay and complete the transformation. Leave and lose everything you've learned. I looked at my hands and saw the water moving through me as if my body was becoming permeable. The boundary between flesh and liquid was dissolving, just as the boundary between mind and reality was blurring. What happens if I say no? The chamber's lights dimmed, and I felt something vast and cold turn its attention toward me. The pressure in my skull became almost unbearable. Those who glimpse our truth cannot simply return unchanged, the voice came, no longer pretending to be Sarah. The knowledge reshapes the mind that contains it. Already your consciousness is expanding beyond your brain's capacity to contain it. I knew it was right. Equations danced behind my eyes, each one containing universes of understanding that threatened to overwhelm my sanity. The melody that had haunted my dreams was inside me now, restructuring my thoughts into new geometries. But I can help you, I said, finally understanding. I can prepare others, help them understand gradually, so they don't break when they learn the truth. The presence seemed to consider this. The choice crystallized in that moment. I could stay, become like Sarah, part of this vast library of impossible knowledge, or I could return, changed but still human, to serve as a bridge between worlds. The pressure in my mind intensified. Images flooded through me, ocean levels rising, coastal cities drowning, humanity forced to adapt or perish. And beneath it all, these ancient architects waiting to guide our evolution. You understand the price? The entity asked. You will never be fully human again. The knowledge will burn in you, drive you. Many will call you mad. I understand, I said, and made my choice. The ascent was a blur of shifting realities. My guideline had disappeared, but I no longer needed it. The water itself seemed to guide me, carrying me up through passages that twisted through dimensions I could now partially perceive. The entity's final message echoed in my mind. We will be watching. When they are ready, bring them to us. I broke the surface at sunset, my mind burning with equations that would revolutionize physics and biological formulas that would transform medicine. But I could feel them slipping away, becoming indistinct, like memories of a dream. Isabel found me sitting by the cenote's edge, writing frantically in my waterproof notebook. The equations were fading, but I managed to capture enough, just fragments. But they would be enough to start with. "Marcus, what happened down there? You were out of contact for hours." I looked up at her, seeing the world through changed eyes. The water of the cenote pulsed with patterns I'd never noticed before. In the distance I could hear that familiar melody, calling to others who might be ready to understand. "We need to talk," I said, "about the future and what's waiting for us in the deep." The dense Queensland forest has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. My father, Tom, grew up as the son of a forest ranger, his childhood playground stretching across acres of untamed wilderness. As I grew older, he made it his mission to share his love for the great outdoors with me, his only child. Every school holiday and long weekend, we'd pack up our old Land Cruiser and head out into the heart of the forest, leaving behind the comforts of our suburban home for the rugged embrace of nature. I was born James Hawthorne, but everyone calls me Jamie. At 17, I'm lanky and awkward with a mop of unruly brown hair that refuses to be tamed. My pale skin, which burns easily under the harsh Australian sun, is a stark contrast to my father's weathered, tanned complexion. Despite our physical differences, we share an unbreakable bond forged through countless adventures in the wilderness. Our forest expeditions were more than just father-son bonding time. They were an education. Dad taught me how to track animals, start a fire with nothing but sticks and determination, and navigate using only the stars and the moss on tree trunks. But more than anything, he taught me respect for the land and its secrets. "The forest has a memory, Jamie," he'd often say, his eyes scanning the canopy above us. "It remembers everything that's happened within its borders, both good and bad. You've got to listen to it, son. It'll tell you when something's not right." At the time, I thought it was just another one of Dad's nuggets of forest wisdom, like how to tell which berries were safe to eat, or how to avoid disturbing a snake's nest. I didn't realize then how prophetic those words would become. One place Dad loved to take us was a dilapidated farm hidden deep within the forest. It was impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look, invisible from the main logging roads and hiking trails. The locals knew it as Spike's Hut, named after its former owner, a man whose reputation still echoed through the trees long after his departure. I remember the first time Dad took me there. I was about 10 years old, full of energy and curiosity. We'd been driving for hours along bumpy dirt tracks that barely qualified as roads. The Land Cruiser's suspension groaned in protest with every pothole and exposed root we encountered. "Where are we going, Dad?" I'd asked for what felt like the 100th time, my patience wearing thin. Dad's eyes twinkled with a mix of excitement and something else I couldn't quite place. "We're going to a special place, Jamie, a place with history. But you've got to promise me something, okay?" I nodded eagerly, always ready for a new adventure. "When we get there, you stay close to me. No wandering off, no matter what you see or hear. Got it?" The seriousness in his voice sent a shiver down my spine, but I agreed nonetheless. Little did I know that this visit would be the first of many, each one peeling back layers of a dark history that perhaps should have remained buried. As we rounded a final bend, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood a ramshackle structure that looked like it had been pieced together from the scraps of a dozen different buildings. The tin roof was rusted and sagging, held up by walls that seemed to lean at impossible angles. Around the hut, the remnants of what must have once been a productive farm lay scattered, broken fences, rusted machinery, and overgrown fields reclaimed by the relentless Australian bush. "Welcome to Spike's Hut," Dad announced, killing the engine. I pressed my face against the window, taking in every detail. Despite the warm spring day, I felt a chill creep over me. Something about this place felt wrong. It was as if the very air around the hut was heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. "Who's Spike?" I asked as we climbed out of the car. Dad's face darkened. Spike Buchanan was a local farmer who lived here for decades, right up until the mid-90s. He wasn't what you'd call a friendly neighbor. As we approached the hut, Dad began to tell me about Spike. The stories painted a picture of a man who seemed to have stepped out of a horror novel, abrasive, violent, and utterly indifferent to the suffering of others. Spike had a reputation for approaching men in the local bar who wore earrings and tearing them out without warning or remorse. There were whispers of people who had crossed him disappearing without a trace, their fates known only to the silent trees surrounding Spike's property. "Why would anyone want to live out here all alone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as we stood in the shadow of the decaying hut. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "Some people, Jamie, they can't live with others, or maybe others can't live with them." As we explored the property that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. Dad seemed on edge too, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings as he pointed out the remnants of Spike's life. "See those marks on the doorframe?" he said, pointing to a series of deep gouges in the wood. "Spike used to notch it every time he—" Dad's voice trailed off, and he shook his head. "Never mind. Some stories are best left untold." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Dad ushered me back to the car. As we drove away, I turned to look back at Spike's hut. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in one of the broken windows, watching us leave, but when I blinked, it was gone. That night, as we camped in a more hospitable part of the forest, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, unable to shake the image of that decrepit hut from my mind. The stories Dad had told me swirled in my imagination, populating the darkness with sinister shapes and unseen threats. "Dad," I whispered, knowing he was still awake, "why did you take me there?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Because sometimes, Jamie, the most important lessons are the ones that scare us a little. The forest isn't always a friendly place. Neither are the people in it. You need to learn to trust your instincts, to recognize when something's not right." I nodded in the darkness, not fully understanding but sensing the weight of his words. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a silent promise to myself that I would never return to Spike's hut. As the years passed, our visits to Spike's hut became a regular part of our forest excursions. Each time we returned, the structure seemed more dilapidated, as if the very earth beneath it was trying to reclaim the land Spike had stolen. The roof sagged a little more, the walls leaned at even more precarious angles, and the undergrowth crept ever closer, threatening to swallow the hut whole. But while the physical appearance of the place deteriorated, the atmosphere remained unchanged. That palpable sense of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking our every move, never wavered. If anything, it intensified with each visit, as if whatever presence lingered there was growing bolder, more curious about the interlopers who dared to trespass on its domain. I was 14 when I first noticed the signs that we weren't the only ones visiting Spike's hut. It was a crisp autumn day, the air filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. As Dad and I approached the clearing, I spotted something that hadn't been there on our last visit, a cluster of 44-gallon drums arranged in a rough circle near the hut. "Dad," I said, pointing, "look at that." He followed my gaze, his brow furrowing. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice tight. I watched as he approached the drums cautiously, his body tense, ready to react to any sudden movement. When he reached them, he peered inside one, then quickly recoiled, his face a mask of disgust. "What is it?" I called out, my curiosity overriding my apprehension. Dad walked back to me, his expression grim. "They're full of smashed beer bottles," he said. "Hundreds of them. Someone's been having parties out here." The idea of anyone willingly spending time at Spike's hut, let alone having a party there, sent a chill down my spine. Who would choose this place, with its oppressive atmosphere and dark history, as a spot for celebration? As we continued our exploration that day, we found more evidence of recent human activity. There was a fire pit near the hut, the ashes still warm to the touch. Scraps of food packaging littered the ground, and here and there we spotted fresh tire tracks in the muddy soil. "Maybe it's just some local kids," I suggested, trying to rationalize the signs of life in a place that had always felt more dead than alive. "You know, looking for a spooky place to hang out?" Dad shook his head, his eyes never stopping their constant scan of our surroundings. "Maybe," he said, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe it. But whoever they are, they're taking a big risk. This place isn't safe." I wanted to ask him what he meant, what specific danger he feared, but something in his demeanor stopped me. There were times when Dad seemed to know more about Spike's hut than he let on, as if he was privy to secrets he wasn't ready to share. As we left that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. The beer bottles, the fire pit, they were like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. And underlying it all was a growing sense of dread, a certainty that something was building, gathering strength in the shadows of Spike's hut. That night I had my first nightmare about the place. In my dream, I was alone at the hut, the forest around me eerily silent. As I approached the building, I could hear whispers coming from inside, a cacophony of voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I knew I should run, that I was in terrible danger, but my feet carried me forward against my will. As I reached for the door, it swung open on its own, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow all light. And from that darkness a hand reached out, gnarled, scarred, with dirt-encrusted fingernails. It grabbed my wrist, its grip like iron, and began to pull me in. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Dad rushed into my room, concern etched on his face. "Jamie, what's wrong?" he asked, sitting on the edge of my bed. I told him about the dream, watching as his expression grew more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring at the wall, as if he could see through it to some distant point. "It was just a dream," he said finally, but there was a hollowness to his words, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Spike's hut, the stories, they're getting to you. Maybe we should take a break from going there for a while." I nodded, grateful for the suggestion. But even as Dad left the room, assuring me that everything was fine, I couldn't shake the lingering terror of the dream. It had felt so real, so vivid, and somewhere deep inside a voice whispered that it wasn't just a nightmare, it was a warning. The next few months passed without any trips to Spike's hut. We still went camping in the forest, but Dad steered clear of that particular area, finding new spots for us to explore. Yet even as we hiked new trails and discovered hidden waterfalls, my thoughts kept drifting back to that decaying structure in the heart of the woods. I found myself researching the history of the area, poring over old newspapers and local history books in the town library. Most of what I found aligned with the stories Dad had told me. Spike Buchanan had been a real person, a farmer who had lived on that isolated property for decades before disappearing in the mid-1990s. But there were other stories too, whispers and rumors that painted an even darker picture. There were reports of hikers going missing in the area around Spike's property, their bodies never found. Locals spoke in hushed tones about strange lights seen in the forest at night, and eerie sounds that couldn't be explained by any known animal. One afternoon, as I was leaving the library with a stack of photocopied newspaper articles, I quite literally ran into old Pete, a local who had lived in the area his entire life. As I helped him pick up his dropped books, apologizing profusely, he squinted at the papers I was carrying. "Researching Spike's place, are you?" he asked, his rheumy eyes suddenly sharp. I nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" Old Pete chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Not many other reasons for a young fellow like yourself to be digging through moldy old papers. Let me give you some advice, son. Leave it alone. Some stories are better left untold, some places better left unexplored." His words echoed those my father had spoken years ago, sending a shiver down my spine. "Did you know Spike?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Old Pete's face darkened. "Knew him? Aye, I knew him. Everyone around here did. Man was a devil in human skin, if you ask me. The things he did." He trailed off, shaking his head. "What things?" I pressed, sensing I was on the verge of uncovering something important. But old Pete just patted me on the shoulder, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. "Go home, boy. Forget about Spike and his cursed land. Nothing good ever came from stirring up old ghosts." As he shuffled away, leaving me standing there with my pile of papers, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. Old Pete's warning, far from discouraging me, only fueled my determination to uncover the truth about Spike's hut. The summer I turned 17 marked a turning point in my relationship with Spike's hut and the mysteries that surrounded it. By then, my fascination with the place had grown into something bordering on obsession. I had filled notebooks with information gleaned from old newspapers, local gossip, and my own observations during our infrequent visits. Dad had become increasingly reluctant to take me there, always finding excuses to explore other parts of the forest, but I could sense his unease whenever I brought up the subject. It was a sweltering day in late January when everything changed. I had convinced a group of my friends, Will, Zach, and Katie, to join Dad and me on a camping trip. They were all city kids, more comfortable with video games than sleeping bags, but the promise of adventure and my endless tales about Spike's hut had finally worn down their resistance. As we piled into Dad's Land Cruiser, the excitement was palpable. Will and Zach were arguing good-naturedly about who would be the first to spot a deadly snake or spider, while Katie rolled her eyes and tried to get a signal on her phone. Dad looked tense, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as we pulled out of our driveway. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying that tone of forced casualness I had come to recognize, "we're just going for a nice, relaxing camping trip. No ghost hunting or anything crazy, all right?" We all nodded, but I caught Will's eye in the rearview mirror and saw the glint of mischief there. We had already made plans to sneak off and explore Spike's hut on our own, regardless of Dad's warnings. The drive seemed to take longer than usual, the forest roads rougher and more overgrown than I remembered. By the time we turned onto the barely visible track that led to Spike's property, even Zach had fallen silent, sensing the change in atmosphere. As we emerged into the clearing where the hut stood, I felt the familiar weight of dread settle over me. But this time something was different. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Dad pulled the Land Cruiser to a stop, the engine's rumble fading to leave us in an eerie silence. For a moment no one moved, all of us taking in the dilapidated structure before us. "Is that it?" Katie whispered, her earlier bravado gone. "It looks wrong." I knew exactly what she meant. Spike's hut had always given off an unsettling vibe, but today it seemed to radiate malevolence. The shadows around it seemed deeper, the angles of its sagging roof more grotesque. Dad cleared his throat. "All right, everyone out, but stay close to the car. I want to show you something. Then we'll head to our campsite." As we climbed out, stretching our legs after the long drive, I scanned our surroundings out of habit. That's when I saw it, a figure on the hill opposite the hut. At first glance, it looked like a cowboy, slumped against a lone tree, hat pulled low over his face as if taking a nap. But something about the posture was off. No one would choose to sleep in such an uncomfortable position, spine curved at an unnatural angle, limbs splayed awkwardly. "Dad?" I called out, my voice tight with sudden fear. "Look, on the hill." Everyone turned to follow my gaze. Dad's reaction was immediate and alarming. His face drained of color, and in one fluid motion, he was herding us back into the car. "Change of plans," he said, his voice brooking no argument. "We're going to check out a different spot." "But we just got here," Zach protested. "What about—" "Now," Dad snapped, already turning the key in the ignition. As we pulled away, I craned my neck to keep the figure in sight. It hadn't moved an inch despite the noise of our arrival and hasty departure. Just before we rounded a bend in the road, I could have sworn I saw its head turn, following our retreat. "Dad, what was that?" I asked once we were well away from Spike's hut. "Who was that man?" "What man?" Will piped up from the back seat. "I didn't see anyone." I turned to look at him, confusion etched on my face. "The cowboy on the hill. You must have seen him." But Will, Zach, and Katie all shook their heads, looking at me with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "There was no one there, Jamie," Katie said gently. "Just trees and shadows." I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it again. How could they not have seen the figure? It had been right there, plain as day. I turned to my father, seeking confirmation, but he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched tight. The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Dad found us a campsite by a picturesque stream, far from Spike's hut. We set up tents, built a fire, and roasted marshmallows, but an undercurrent of tension ran beneath it all. My friends kept shooting me worried glances, and Dad remained uncharacteristically quiet. That night, as the others slept, I lay awake in my tent, replaying the scene at Spike's hut over and over in my mind. I was certain of what I'd seen, a figure, unnaturally still, watching us from the hill. But if the others hadn't seen it, what did that mean? Was I losing my mind, seeing things that weren't there? Or was there something more sinister at play? I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake, heart pounding. Something had woken me, a sound just on the edge of hearing. I lay still, straining my ears. There it was again, a whisper carried on the night breeze, words I couldn't quite make out, but which filled me with an inexplicable dread. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my tent and peered out. The campsite was bathed in silvery moonlight, shadows dancing as clouds scudded across the sky. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then movement caught my eye. At the edge of our campsite, just where the firelight faded into darkness, stood a figure. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the silhouette, the same cowboy from the hill, still in that unnatural slumped posture. As I watched, frozen in terror, its head began to turn towards me with agonizing slowness. I scrambled backward, zipping the tent closed and burying myself in my sleeping bag. I wanted to scream, to wake the others, but fear had robbed me of my voice. I lay there, shaking, ears straining for any sound of approach. Minutes stretched into hours, each rustle of leaves outside sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. By the time dawn broke, I was a wreck, exhausted and on edge. As we packed up camp that morning, I debated whether to tell the others what I'd seen. But the memory of their disbelief the day before held me back. Instead, I watched Dad, wondering if he knew more than he was letting on. It wasn't until we were nearly home, the forest giving way to familiar suburban streets, that Dad finally broke his silence. "Jamie," he said, his voice low so the others in the back seat wouldn't hear. "What you saw yesterday, I need you to forget about it, for your own good." I stared at him, a mix of emotions churning in my gut. "You saw it too, didn't you? The cowboy. Why didn't you say anything?" Dad's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Some things are better left alone, son. Spike's hut, the cowboy, they're part of a history that should stay buried." "But, no," he cut me off, his tone final. "Promise me you'll let this go. No more visits to the hut, no more research. It's not safe." I wanted to argue, to demand answers to the questions that had been building for years. But something in Dad's expression stopped me. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Okay," I said finally. "I promise." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was a promise I couldn't keep. The mystery of Spike's hut and the cowboy on the hill had sunk its hooks into me too deeply. I needed answers, no matter the cost. As we dropped my friends off at their homes, each of them giving me worried looks as they left, I began to formulate a plan. Dad might refuse to help, but I wasn't alone in my curiosity. There were others who had grown up with the legends of Spike's hut, others who might be willing to help me uncover the truth. The weeks following our aborted camping trip passed in a blur of mundane routine, but beneath the surface my mind was racing. Despite my promise to Dad, I couldn't shake the image of the cowboy on the hill, nor the unsettling encounter at our campsite. Each night I found myself jolting awake, convinced I could hear whispers on the edge of hearing, only to be met with the ordinary sounds of our quiet suburban street. At school I went through the motions, my thoughts constantly drifting back to Spike's hut and its mysteries. My friends noticed the change in me. Will and Zach tried to draw me out with jokes and invitations to hang out, while Katie watched me with concern, often catching my eye with a questioning look I couldn't bring myself to answer. It was Katie who finally cornered me one afternoon as I was leaving the school library, my arms laden with books on local history and folklore. "All right, Jamie," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "Spill. What's going on with you?" I hesitated, weighing my options. Katie had always been the most level-headed of our group, quick to debunk ghost stories and urban legends, but she was also fiercely loyal and had a knack for research that could prove invaluable. Making a split-second decision, I nodded towards an empty classroom. "Not here. Come on." Once inside, I dumped my books on a desk and turned to face her. You remember the camping trip? Spike's hut? Katie's brow furrowed. You mean that creepy old shack your dad wouldn't let us explore? Yeah, what about it? Taking a deep breath, I launched into the story, not just of what I'd seen on the hill and at our campsite, but everything I knew about Spike's hut. The history, the rumors, the unexplained disappearances. As I spoke, I saw the skepticism in Katie's eyes gradually give way to curiosity, and then to something approaching belief. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, absently twirling a strand of her dark hair around her finger, a habit I knew meant she was deep in thought. Okay, she said finally. Let's say I believe you. What do you want to do about it? I blinked, surprised by her acceptance. You believe me? Katie shrugged. I believe you saw something, and I know you, Jamie. You're not the type to make up stories or chase shadows. If you're this worked up about it, there must be something to it. Relief washed over me. For the first time since that day at Spike's hut, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. I want to go back, I said, the plan I'd been mulling over for weeks finally taking shape. Not with Dad or the others, just us. We can do some real investigating, maybe finally figure out what's going on out there. Katie's eyes widened. Are you crazy? After everything you've told me, you want to go back there? Alone? Not alone, I countered. With you. Come on, Katie, don't tell me you're not at least a little curious. She bit her lip, clearly torn between her natural caution and the allure of solving a real mystery. It could be dangerous, she said, but I could hear the wavering in her voice. We'll be careful, I promised. We'll tell our parents we're camping at Bellbird Creek. It's close enough that we can get to Spike's hut and back in a day. We'll bring supplies, stay together, and if anything feels off, we leave immediately. What do you say? Katie stared at me for what felt like an eternity, her green eyes searching my face. Finally, she sighed. I can't believe I'm agreeing to this. Fine, but we do this smart, okay? Research, planning, the works, and if I say we leave, no arguments. I nodded eagerly, already envisioning our expedition. Deal. Thank you, Katie. You won't regret this. As we left the classroom, making plans to meet up that weekend to start our research, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. With Katie's help, I was sure we could unravel the mystery of Spike's hut and the cowboy on the hill. But even as excitement bubbled up inside me, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. Was I leading my friend into danger? Was my obsession with uncovering the truth blinding me to the very real risks we might be facing? I pushed the doubts aside. We would be careful, smart, and finally, I would get the answers I'd been seeking for so long. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Katie and I threw ourselves into research with a fervor that would have impressed our teachers had it been directed at our actual schoolwork. We pored over old newspapers, land records, and local history books. We created timelines, maps, and dossiers on key figures in Spike's hut's history. One name kept coming up in our research, Michael Spike Buchanan. The more we learned about him, the more unsettling the picture became. Spike had moved to the area in the late 1960s, buying the isolated property deep in the forest. From the beginning, he had been a source of fear and suspicion among the locals. Police reports from the time painted a picture of a violent, unpredictable man. There were multiple assault charges, always dropped due to lack of evidence or witnesses suddenly changing their stories. And then there were the disappearances, hikers, campers, even a few locals, all vanishing without a trace in the area around Spike's property. Look at this, Katie said one afternoon, pushing a yellowed newspaper clipping across the table to me. The headline read, "Local man missing, foul play suspected." I scanned the article, my stomach churning. A young man named David Walsh had last been seen at the local pub, arguing with Spike Buchanan. 3 days later, his car was found abandoned on a forest road not far from Spike's property. Despite an extensive search, no trace of David was ever found. There's more, Katie said, her voice low. I cross-referenced the dates of all the disappearances with lunar cycles and weather patterns. Jamie, every single one happened on or near a full moon, on clear nights. I felt a chill run down my spine. What are you saying? Katie shook her head, frustration evident in her furrowed brow. I don't know, it could be coincidence, but it feels deliberate. Like whatever was happening out there, Spike was choosing his moments carefully. As our planned expedition drew closer, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place. But with each new revelation, the shadow looming over Spike's hut grew darker and more menacing. The night before we were set to leave, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The excitement of finally taking action warred with a growing sense of dread. What if we were getting in over our heads? What if the answers we sought were better left undiscovered? As I tossed and turned, a sound from outside my window caught my attention. Soft at first, then growing louder whispers carried on the night breeze. The same whispers I'd heard at the campsite. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peered out. At first I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of our backyard, silvered by moonlight. Then movement caught my eye. At the edge of the forest that bordered our property, a figure stood. Even at this distance, I recognized the slumped posture, the wide-brimmed hat. The cowboy had followed us home. As I watched, frozen in terror, the figure slowly raised its head. Though I couldn't make out its features, I felt its gaze lock onto me with an almost physical force. A voice, dry as dead leaves, drifted through the night. "Coming home, boy. Time to come home." I stumbled back from the window, my legs giving out beneath me. By the time I gathered the courage to look again, the figure was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever really been there at all. As dawn broke, casting pale light through my window, I made a decision. We would go ahead with our plan. Whatever was happening at Spike's hut, whatever forces were at play, I needed answers. The alternative, living with this fear, always looking over my shoulder, was unthinkable. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and sent a text to Katie. "It's time. You ready?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Ready, let's finish this." As I began to pack my bag for our expedition, I tried to shake off the lingering dread from my nighttime encounter. But deep down, I knew we were stepping into something far more dangerous than we could have imagined. The mystery of Spike's hut was about to be unraveled, for better or for worse. The morning of our expedition dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn day that usually filled me with excitement for outdoor adventures. But as I shouldered my heavily laden backpack and made my way to our agreed meeting point, a sense of foreboding hung over me like a shroud. Katie was already waiting when I arrived, her own pack at her feet. The determined set of her jaw told me she was as committed to this as I was, but I could see the nervousness in her eyes. "Last chance to back out," I offered, giving her an out even as I prayed she wouldn't take it. She shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "And let you have all the fun? Not a chance, Hawthorne. We're in this together." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by a pang of guilt. Was I selfishly putting my friend in danger? But Katie's determined expression silenced my doubts. We were in this together, for better or worse. We set off, our steps quick and purposeful. The forest welcomed us with its familiar symphony of rustling leaves and birdsong, but today it felt like a facade, a cheerful mask hiding darker truths. As we hiked, I filled Katie in on my encounter the previous night. "You're sure it wasn't just a dream?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. I shook my head. It felt too real. And after everything we've learned, I don't think we can chalk any of this up to coincidence anymore. Katie nodded grimly. "Well, that's why we're here, right? To get answers." As we drew closer to Spike's hut, the forest seemed to change around us. The birdsong faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, seeming to grasp at our clothes as we passed. Finally, we emerged into the familiar clearing. Spike's hut stood before us, somehow more foreboding than I remembered. The sagging roof, the dark windows like empty eye sockets, it all seemed to radiate a palpable malevolence. "God, this place is creepy," Katie whispered, inching closer to me. I nodded, my eyes scanning the tree line, half expecting to see the cowboy figure watching us. But the clearing was empty save for us and the decaying structure before us. "Okay," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "We stick to the plan. Quick sweep of the exterior, then we go in. Any sign of trouble, we bail. Agreed?" Katie nodded, her hand moving to the pepper spray on her belt. A precaution we'd both agreed was necessary. We circled the hut slowly, noting every detail. The rotting porch creaked ominously under our weight. Rusted farm equipment lay scattered about, half swallowed by encroaching vegetation. And everywhere that feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following our every move. As we rounded the back of the hut, Katie suddenly grabbed my arm. "Jamie," she hissed. "Look." She was pointing at a patch of ground near the tree line. At first I couldn't see what had caught her attention. Then I noticed it, a rectangular depression in the earth about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The perfect size for a grave. My blood ran cold. It could be anything," I stammered, not believing my own words. Katie shook her head. "There's more. Look." As my eyes adjusted, I saw what she meant. There were other depressions, less distinct but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. 5, 10, maybe more, scattered across the clearing's edge. "We should go," Katie said, her voice shaking. This is too much." Part of me wanted to agree, to turn tail and run from this place and never look back. But we'd come too far to give up now. "We can't," I said. "Not yet. We need to know what happened here." Before Katie could protest, I strode towards the hut's entrance. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, offering no resistance as I pushed it open. Musty air rushed out, carrying with it the stench of decay and something else, a metallic tang that made my stomach turn. "Jamie, wait," Katie called, but I was already stepping inside. The interior of Spike's hut was a study in chaos and decay. Broken furniture littered the floor, and the walls were covered in a patchwork of peeling wallpaper and bare, rotting wood. But it was the far wall that drew my attention. Hundreds of photographs were tacked to the wall, overlapping and jumbled. As I moved closer, my flashlight beam illuminating the display, I felt the blood drain from my face. Each photo showed a person, men, women, even a few children. And each face was crossed out with a thick red X. "Oh my God," Katie breathed, coming up beside me. "Are these the missing people?" I finished, my voice barely a whisper. "Spike's victims." As the enormity of what we were seeing sank in, a new sound cut through the silence. A low, guttural growl coming from the darkened doorway behind us. We spun around, flashlights jerking wildly. There, blocking our only exit, stood a figure that could only be described as a nightmare made flesh. It was vaguely human in shape, but twisted, wrong. Matted fur covered its body, and its face. Dear God, its face was a patchwork of human and animal features, as if someone had tried to stitch together a man and a wolf with no regard for nature's laws. "What the fuck is that?" Katie screamed, stumbling backward. The creature, for I couldn't think of it as a man, took a lumbering step forward. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see its eyes, feral and hungry, but with a spark of human intelligence that somehow made it even more terrifying. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Katie's arm and pulling her towards the back of the hut. There had to be another way out, a window, anything. We scrambled over fallen furniture and piles of moldering junk, the creature's growls growing louder behind us. I spotted a window, its glass long since shattered, and shoved Katie towards it. "Go," I urged, turning to face our pursuer, hoping to buy her time to escape. The creature was closer now, close enough that I could smell its fetid breath. It opened its mouth, a maw filled with razor-sharp teeth, and spoke, its voice a guttural parody of human speech. "Fresh meat," it growled. "Been so long." Terror clouded my mind, but one thought broke through, the cowboy, the figure I'd seen. Had this been him all along? Some monstrous transformation of Spike Buchanan, twisted by whatever dark forces held sway in this cursed place? I had no time to ponder. The creature lunged impossibly fast. I ducked, feeling claws rake the air where my head had been a moment before. Scrambling backward, I felt my hand close around something solid, a piece of broken furniture, heavy in my grip. With strength born of desperation, I swung the makeshift weapon. It connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature howled in pain and rage. Not waiting to see if I'd done any real damage, I turned and dove through the window, feeling glass shards slice into my skin. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. For a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping. Then Katie was there, hauling me to my feet. "Come on!" she screamed. "It's coming!" We ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Behind us, I could hear the creature's enraged howls, spurred on by the scent of our blood and fear. How long we ran, I couldn't say. Time seemed to lose all meaning as we fled through the darkening forest. Every shadow held potential danger, every snapping twig the herald of our doom. Finally, lungs burning and legs trembling, we burst out onto a familiar logging road. In the distance I could see lights, civilization, safety. We staggered towards the lights, constantly looking over our shoulders. But the creature, it seemed, had given up the chase. Or perhaps it couldn't leave the confines of its domain. Either way, as we reached the outskirts of town, I felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. What was that thing?" Katie gasped, bent double and gulping air. I shook my head, wincing at the myriad cuts and bruises making themselves known, now that the adrenaline was fading. "I don't know, but I think we found out what happened to Spike Buchanan and all those missing people." Katie straightened up, her face pale in the gathering dusk. "We have to tell someone, the police, your dad, anyone." But even as she spoke, I knew it was hopeless. Who would believe us? A monster in the woods, a decades-old mystery of missing persons? We'd be laughed out of the police station, or worse, accused of making up stories to cover some misdeed of our own. "We can't," I said, the weight of our discovery settling over me like a shroud. "Who'd believe us? We don't have any proof, and if we lead people out there—" I didn't need to finish the thought. We both knew what fate would await anyone who ventured unprepared into Spike's domain. "So what do we do?" Katie asked, her voice small and afraid. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my scattered thoughts. "We keep this to ourselves for now, but we prepare, research, plan. Whatever that thing is, whatever's happening out there, it's not over, and next time we'll be ready." As we limped back into town, concocting a story about getting lost on a hike to explain our battered state, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd set something in motion. The mystery of Spike's hut was far from solved. In fact, it had only deepened, taking on a dimension of horror I could never have imagined. But one thing was certain: our lives would never be the same. The darkness we'd glimpsed in the heart of the forest had marked us, and I knew with grim certainty that it wouldn't let us go easily. Our ordeal was far from over. It had only just begun. The weeks following our harrowing encounter at Spike's hut passed in a blur of normalcy that felt surreal after what we'd experienced. Katie and I went through the motions of our daily lives, attending classes, doing homework, hanging out with friends. But beneath it all ran an undercurrent of tension and fear. We'd agreed to keep what we'd seen to ourselves, at least until we could make sense of it. But the weight of our secret was taking its toll. I caught Katie watching the tree line with wary eyes whenever we were outside, and I found myself jumping at shadows, always half expecting to see that monstrous figure lurking just out of sight. It was about a month after our ill-fated expedition when the first disappearance was reported. A hiker, a tourist from interstate, had gone missing in the national park not far from Spike's property. The news hit me like a physical blow, memories of those photographs on the wall of the hut flashing through my mind. "It's starting again," Katie said when I called her, her voice tight with fear. "Jamie, we have to do something." But what could we do? We had no proof, no way to explain what we'd seen without sounding insane. And always there was the fear. What if we led others into danger? What if our warnings only resulted in more victims for the creature that had once been Spike Buchanan? It was this dilemma that led me back to the town library, poring over old records and newspapers, searching for any clue that might help us understand what we were dealing with. Katie joined me when she could, but I could see the strain it was putting on her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she flinched at every unexpected sound. "Maybe we should tell your dad," she suggested one afternoon as we huddled over a stack of microfiche. "He knows something about Spike's hut. He might believe us." I shook my head, remembering the fear in Dad's eyes when he'd warned me away from the place. "No. Whatever he knows, he's trying to protect me from it. I can't drag him into this." Katie sighed, rubbing her temples. "Then what? We can't just sit back and watch people disappear." Before I could respond, a shadow fell across our table. We looked up to see old Pete, the local I'd run into months ago when I first started researching Spike's hut. His rheumy eyes narrowed as he took in the material spread before us. "Still digging, I see," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Didn't I warn you to leave it alone?" I exchanged a glance with Katie before turning back to the old man. "Mr. Pete," I said, choosing my words carefully, "we need to know. What really happened out there? What is Spike Buchanan?" Old Pete was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as if looking into the past. Finally, he pulled up a chair, settling his weathered frame with a groan. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "The thing in the woods, the monster wearing Spike's skin." Katie inhaled sharply, but I just nodded, waiting for the old man to continue. Pete sighed, suddenly looking every one of his many years. "It was different back then, you know. The forest was wilder, darker. There were places a man could disappear and never be found. Spike, he knew those places better than anyone." He went on to paint a picture of Spike Buchanan as a loner, a man who shunned society for the solitude of the deep woods. But there was more to it than that. Spike had been searching for something, old Pete said, something ancient and powerful. "There were stories," Pete continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Old stories from before the white men came, about a place deep in the forest where the veil between worlds was thin, where a man could make a bargain with things that ain't meant to walk in our world." I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering the twisted figure we'd encountered in Spike's hut. "What kind of bargain?" I asked, dreading the answer. Pete's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and grim knowledge. "Power, immortality, but there's always a price, boy, always." He went on to explain how Spike had vanished into the forest for weeks at a time, returning changed. How the disappearances had started soon after, hikers, campers, even locals who ventured too far into Spike's territory. "We knew," Pete said, his voice heavy with old guilt. "Deep down we all knew what was happening, but fear makes cowards of us all. We turned a blind eye, told ourselves it was just accidents, bad luck, anything but face the truth." As Pete's tale unfolded, the pieces began to fall into place. Spike's bargain, his transformation, the years of disappearances, it all led to that nightmarish encounter in the decaying hut. "But why now?" Katie asked, breaking her silence. "Why is it starting again after all these years?" Old Pete shrugged, his expression grim. "The hunger never stops, girl. It just sleeps sometimes, but something's woken it up. And now—" He trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. As we left the library that day, our heads spinning with this new information, I felt a fierce determination take hold. We might not be able to undo the horrors of the past, but we could stop history from repeating itself. "We need a plan," I told Katie as we walked home. "A way to end this once and for all." She nodded, her face set in grim determination. "Whatever it takes, we can't let anyone else disappear." But even as we began to formulate our strategy, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in over our heads. We were just two teenagers, armed with nothing but determination and half-understood legends. What chance did we really have against a monster that had eluded justice for decades? As night fell, casting long shadows across the town, I found myself staring out my bedroom window towards the distant forest. Somewhere out there, in the depths of those ancient trees, a horror beyond imagining waited. And whether we were ready or not, I knew we would have to face it. The final confrontation was coming. All we could do now was prepare, and hope that when the time came, we would be strong enough to end the nightmare that had haunted these woods for far too long. The days that followed our conversation with old Pete were a whirlwind of activity. Katie and I threw ourselves into preparation with a fervor born of desperation. We pored over every scrap of information we could find about local legends, folklore, and the occult, searching for anything that might give us an edge against the monstrous entity that Spike Buchanan had become. We also began to train in our own limited way. Katie took up running, building her stamina for what we both knew would be a grueling ordeal. I started practicing with my dad's old hunting rifle, hoping I'd never have to use it, but knowing I needed to be prepared. All the while, reports of missing hikers and campers continued to trickle in. Each new disappearance was like a knife to the gut, a reminder of our failure to act sooner. The local authorities were baffled, searching in all the wrong places, never suspecting the true horror that lurked in the heart of the forest. It was about 2 weeks into our preparations when we made a breakthrough. In an old book of local folklore, we found a ritual said to bind malevolent spirits to their place of origin. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead we had. As we gathered the necessary materials, a sense of foreboding grew. The forest seemed to darken, storms gathering on the horizon. It was as if nature itself was reacting to the approaching confrontation. On a moonless night, Katie and I ventured into the forest one last time. The trek to Spike's hut was tense, every shadow seeming to hide potential threats. When we arrived, the clearing was eerily still. We began the ritual, our voices shaking as we recited the ancient words. Suddenly, a bone-chilling howl split the air. The creature that had once been Spike Buchanan burst from the hut, its eyes blazing with inhuman rage. What followed was a nightmarish battle of wits and will. We dodged the creature's attacks, leading it into the circle we had prepared. As the final words of the ritual left our lips, a blinding light erupted from the ground. The creature howled in agony as spectral chains wrapped around it, binding it to the earth. With a final earth-shaking roar, it dissolved into mist, seeping into the ground and disappearing.